Hey guys, tonight we're going way off the beaten path into convents, kitchens and confessionals to unearth a slice of history that's been conveniently scrubbed from your textbooks. We're talking about how medieval women pleasured themselves. Yep, that. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting dusty lectures or polite euphemisms, because what we're about to unpack is messy, deeply human and whispered across centuries through scribbled margins and forbidden objects hidden under floorboards. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and the time you're tuning in, especially if it's past 1 AM. No judgment. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing inside a stone cloister in the English countryside. It's late, the candlelight flickers, and you can almost hear the silence breathing through the cold hallway. This is a women's abbey, maybe 12th century, with carved arches and worn wooden doors. It smells like incense, parchment, and damp wool. Outside the world is chaos, plagues, war, patriarchy doing its hey thing, but in here there are rules, silence, discipline, chastity, but rules, as you're about to learn, are just invitations to secrecy. You follow the faint sound of laughter through the garden courtyard, and peek into a scriptorium where a group of nuns are copying texts by hand. One young woman, Juliana, glances up, eyes playful. She's supposed to be transcribing psalms, but tucked inside her manuscript is a fragment of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a Roman text on the art of love. The margins are full of little doodles, vines curling like fingers, fruit split open in ways that make your brain stutter. And Juliana? She knows exactly what she's doing. See, even within the supposed sanctity of the convent, curiosity burns. These women, cloistered since girlhood, were human. They had bodies. They had desires. They also had time, long hours of solitude, routines that left space for the mind to wander. And wander it did. Juliana, like many nuns of her time, was literate. The church taught reading for the sake of scripture, but once you can trad, you can read anything. Erotic poetry, anatomical treatises, herbal manuals, anything that slipped in under the radar. Her favourite? A heavily censored copy of The Golden Asses by Apuleius, a Roman novel that includes a pretty vivid scene with a woman, a lamp, and, well, let's just say it involves some private experimentation. The page corners are worn, take that as you will. But here's the reality check. Medieval society, and especially the church, was obsessed with regulating sexuality. Female pleasure? It was viewed with suspicion, even fear. Masturbation was a sin, a gateway to spiritual decay, they claimed. Yet nuns kept journals. Not all survived, but a few have. One abbey chronicle from 1311 describes Sister Agnes flagellating herself for unholy thoughts and touching, followed by 3 days of fasting and silence. But, and here's the kicker, she wrote it with so much emotional weight, so much detail, that it reads like confession meets fantasy. It leaves you wondering if the shame was the point or the thrill, and that's where the first crack in the pristine abbey wall shows itself. A historian once stumbled across a bizarre relic inside a sealed chamber of a ruined convent in France, a polished wooden cylinder, curved at one end, with faint inscriptions in Latin. Next to it, a rosary and a copy of the Vita Sanctae Julianae. It's never been publicly displayed. Museums don't quite know what to label it. Devotional object is the polite term, but let's be real. It looks less like a prayer aid and more like a hands-on form of self-reflection. The quirky fact: the Latin inscription translates loosely to, "My body is God's garden, and I shall tend it alone," and that sums it up. For some women, especially cloistered ones, there was an entire emotional and spiritual framework built around their relationship with their own bodies. They lived in a paradox, denying desire while obsessing over it, punishing themselves for urges that were entirely human. That kind of inner conflict didn't always suppress pleasure. Sometimes it eroticized it. Now, scholars have been arguing about this for decades. Some say we're reading too much into scraps, projecting modern ideas onto medieval minds. Others argue the clues are too consistent to ignore. The combination of hidden erotic literature, confessional entries, relics with ambiguous uses. It paints a picture. Maybe not a crystal clear one, but certainly a vivid mosaic of how women found ways to connect with their own desire, even under the strictest of restrictions. You leave the scriptorium and step into the cloister's private garden, the herbs sharp in the evening air, sage, rue, and something musky and sweet you can't quite place. Juliana's voice drifts through your thoughts like a chant. She's still copying psalms, yes, but in her mind she's somewhere else entirely. Maybe with a forbidden book, maybe with her hands under her habit. And you realise this wasn't some isolated fantasy. It was a quiet form of rebellion, a private sanctuary carved from flesh and thought. The walls around them were made of stone, but inside those walls, women still imagined, touched, longed, and yes, masturbated. It was never just about sin, it was about survival. You step back out into the stone corridor, the air heavy with incense and centuries of unsaid things. You're still thinking about Juliana, her hidden texts, her careful doodles, and the quiet heat in the margins of her sacred work. But now you're moving beyond the convent walls, out into the wider world where sin wasn't just a whisper in the chapel, it was a full-on public spectacle. If you thought personal pleasure was complicated behind cloistered doors, just wait until you meet the church's public face. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where everything is forbidden, especially the things people secretly enjoy. The church didn't mess around when it came to desire. Any form of sexual activity outside marriage, heck, even inside marriage if it was too enthusiastic, was suspect. But masturbation, that was on another level of spiritual threat. For women, it wasn't just sinful, it was unnatural, a sign of disorder, a crack in the holy armour of femininity. The official message was clear. Desire belonged to men, chastity to women. The female body was supposed to be passive, receptive, obedient. You're not here to want, you're here to serve, birth, or be celibate. Those were the options. Not exactly a buffet. Theologians loved to talk about lust. And by loved, I mean they obsessed over it in treatises so long they make modern comment sections look mercifully short. St. Jerome, one of the big names in early Christian thought, wrote about a monk who couldn't stop picturing dancing girls. He recommended fasting and self-flagellation, classic medieval spiritual hacks. But what happens when the person lusting isn't a monk but a bored wife or a lonely widow? Suddenly it's less about saving her soul and more about tightening the leash. And here's where it gets deeply ironic. The church wrote so much about sin, describing it, warning against it, elaborating in loving detail what not to do, that they basically created a medieval sex ed manual by accident. It's like telling someone not to think of pink elephants and then acting shocked when they're suddenly surrounded by imaginary herds. One famous 13th century penitential manual, basically a priest's handbook for handing out punishments, lists female masturbation right alongside adultery and bestiality. The penance, fasting on bread and water for 40 days. But here's the twist. The text spends several paragraphs describing how exactly a woman might commit the sin, what objects she might use, and how frequently. Suspiciously thorough, father. Now imagine being a regular woman hearing all this. Maybe you're a teenager in a small village, or a merchant's wife, or a widow with your own home, a rare luxury. You go to confession and the priest starts asking very specific questions about what you do when you're alone. Even if you weren't doing anything before, now the ideas are floating in your head like smoke. That's not an accident. This is the part where we pause and bring in the quirky fact of the night. In the 14th century, there's a recorded case of a priest in Italy who became so obsessed with this with female confessionals that he eventually wrote a personal guide to detecting hidden sins. It included questions like, do your hands stray under your garments at night? And, have you ever placed pressure between your thighs while thinking of a man? This was less spiritual guidance and more softcore interrogation. He was eventually removed from his post for scandalous behaviour, though the record doesn't say whether he was punished or just transferred to a different parish. Classic medieval HR. But here's where the debate kicks in. Were all these warnings and writings just projection? Did the church sincerely believe women were seething cauldrons of ungovernable lust? Or were they trying to create that belief to justify more control? Some scholars argue that the clergy's fixation on female desire had more to do with their own anxiety than anything real. Others say we underestimate how genuinely terrified medieval people were of bodies in general, women's especially. Menstruation, childbirth, arousal, all seen as messy, dangerous, and spiritually suspect. So if a woman enjoyed her body, even in private, she was breaking more than a rule, she was disrupting the natural order. Back in your mental time machine, you drift through a village square. It's market day. You hear gossip and laughter, chickens, the sharp smell of herbs and sweat. Among the bustle is a small wooden booth where confessions are heard every Sunday. A line of women waits. Some clutch rosaries, others look sheepish. You catch snippets of whispered regrets, envy, laziness, unclean thoughts, but no one dares say the word masturbation. It's too private, too wrapped in shame. Yet you know it's there, hanging in the air like incense, unspoken but deeply felt. You walk with one of them afterward. Her name is Aldith. She's a miller's daughter with rough hands and eyes that have seen more than her years should allow. She laughs easily, but there's tension under the surface. You ask her, carefully, if she ever feels tempted. She smirks. Tempted? What do you think happens when the snow keeps me indoors for days and my mother's visiting the cousins? You raise your eyebrows. She shrugs. If God didn't want me to feel it, why did he put the feeling there? That one sentence sums up the silent rebellion women lived every day. They weren't stupid. They knew what they felt. They knew what the priest said. And still they found ways to live in their bodies, to touch, to feel, to imagine, even if they never spoke of it above a whisper. The shame was institutional, but the pleasure was personal. As you leave the village, the sun dips behind the hills. The church bells ring, calling people to prayer. You glance back at the little booth where sins were weighed and assigned penance. But Aldith, she's already home, probably peeling onions or laughing with her sisters. Later tonight, when the fire's out and the house is quiet, maybe she'll remember that feeling, that warm, humming truth in her core, and maybe she'll honour it, not as a sin, but as a secret that belongs only to her. The next morning breaks with birdsong and dew. You step out of Aldith's memory and into the narrow alley behind an apothecary's shop, one that smells like crushed violets, vinegar, and something vaguely musky. The shop is cluttered and chaotic, the shelves bowing under jars labelled in Latin, and symbols you don't recognise. Dried bundles hang from the ceiling like sleeping bats, lavender, mugwort, yarrow, and in the far corner sits a woman grinding something into a dark green paste. Her name is Letta. She's not a nun, not a priest, not anyone with formal power, and yet half the town visits her when they need things that they're too embarrassed to ask for at a church. Letta knows what women want, not just babies or relief from headaches or a way to hex an unfaithful husband. She knows about hunger, the kind that starts deep in the stomach and moves lower, burning slow. Most women don't even have the words to explain it, but they come in with flushed cheeks and awkward questions. What do I take to help me sleep? They ask, eyes averted. Something for the nerves. And Letta has something, she always does. One of her bestsellers is a blend of damiana, cloves, dried rose petals, and just a pinch of cantharides, aka Spanish fly, though no one calls it that out loud. Not because it's illegal, not yet, but because it works too well. One sip and your skin warms, a few drops under the tongue, and suddenly your body remembers it has layers, wants, throbs. Of course the dosage matters. Too much and it's dangerous, too little and it's just fancy tea. Letta's careful. She's watched women go home and come back glowing, a little less anxious, a little more awake. And here's the quirky fact of the day. Damiana, that unassuming little herb. It was used as an aphrodisiac all the way back to the Aztecs, but by the late medieval period, it had made its way into European herbals under vague terms like stirring of the womb or warming of the loins. One 15th century text describes it as a cordial most suitable for melancholic maidens, which, let's be honest, is just medieval speak for girls who needed a good time but had no outlet. Letta isn't operating in a vacuum. Throughout the Middle Ages, midwives, herbalists, and so-called wise women held the real knowledge about the body, especially the female body. This knowledge wasn't always written down, it was whispered, passed from mother to daughter, healer to apprentice. And some of it had to do with pleasure. Yes, they knew how to prevent pregnancy or induce it, but they also knew how to soothe wandering wombs, calm hysterical vapours, and ease the tension that built in lonely wives and overworked housemaids. Here's where the historical debate gets juicy, and some scholars argue that these herbal remedies were just accidental side effects of trying to treat women's illnesses. Others believe the women absolutely knew what they were doing, and that the terms used in old texts like renewing the spirit or restoring warmth to the belly were thinly veiled codes for stimulating arousal or even climax. Because let's be honest, when a recipe involves fennel, cinnamon, honey, and repeated massages to the lower abdomen, It's not just about bloating. You sit across from Letta now, sipping something warm and spiced. She raises an eyebrow. You came in for cough syrup, she says, teasing. But maybe you're looking for something else? Her voice is soft, but there's a knowing edge to it. And just like that, you're folded into a hidden history, a quiet network of women who have always known that the body is not just a vessel for suffering, but a source of power. Letta shows you a little book, bound in soft leather and stained with time. The pages are filled with recipes, one for cramps, one for fertility, one labelled only with a crescent moon and the word shimmer. What's this one do, you ask? She smiles but doesn't answer. Instead, she dips her finger into a small pot of balm and presses it to your wrist. The scent is intoxicating. Amber, orange blossom, something darker. Your skin tingles. The room seems a little warmer now. This is the intimacy that's often forgotten when we talk about history. Not kings and wars and dusty treaties, but women, alone or together, seeking pleasure in coded ways, with herbs, with heated stones, with clever use of wool or carved objects passed from hand to hand under the cover of night. The world outside told them they weren't supposed to feel desire, let alone chase it, but in the privacy of their kitchens, gardens and shared bedrooms, they built a different kind of truth. You thank Letta and leave with a small cloth-wrapped bundle, tied with the twine and secrecy. Outside, the village buzzes with mundane life, goats, gossip, muddy streets. But you carry something ancient and deeply subversive, knowledge that pleasure is not just possible, but yours to claim, and that other women centuries ago did the same. As you walk, the scent of herbs lingers on your skin. You think about the countless women who asked for sleep remedies or womb calmers, knowing full well what they were really getting, and you smile. Because history didn't erase them, it just whispered them into footnotes and shadows. But they're still here, in the scent of Damiana, in the sting of clove, in the curl of a knowing smile passed between women who always knew more than they were supposed to. And tonight, somewhere behind a shuttered window, another woman will light a candle, unwrap a bundle, and take her pleasure quietly, but not alone. You slip out of Letta's apothecary and find yourself drawn to the edge of the village, where the stone paths fade into grass and the trees begin to thicken. A winding trail leads you toward a small cottage tucked in the woods, almost swallowed by ivy. Inside lives a woman named Wulfhild, and no, she's not a healer or a nun, she's a weaver. But the moment you step into her home, you realise she might know just as much about the body as any herbalist. The air is warm, heavy with lanolin, dyed wool and something faintly metallic, like hot stones after rain. You notice her tools, wooden spindles, soft fleece, woven swatches hanging from beams and something else. A polished stone shaped strangely, suggestively. Wulfhild notices your glance and smirks without comment. Welcome to the world of practical ingenuity. Wulfhild lives alone, which is rare. Her husband died years ago, and she never remarried. The village whispers about her, mostly in tones dipped in envy and confusion. Some say she talks to trees, others say she makes charms with too much skill. But the most persistent rumour? That she's content, unbothered, or radiating a quiet satisfaction. And for women in the Middle Ages, that was practically witchcraft. She offers you a stool and some warm beer, and you watch her work the loom. Her hands move with a rhythm that feels almost hypnotic. Each tug and pull of the thread hums like a heartbeat. You ever feel it in your stomach? She asks suddenly, eyes still on her weaving. That ache? That low fire? You nod, unsure if she's asking metaphorically. She isn't. That's when she shows you her collection. Not just tools for weaving, but for comfort, stimulation and curiosity. A hollowed-out handle from an old spindle smooth as riverstone. A curved piece of antler worn at one end. A linen pouch filled with warming herbs meant to be heated by the fire and slipped under skirts. None of them are labelled, none are spoken of publicly, but they're all designed. Purposeful, clearly used. Here's the odd little historical tidbit. There are medieval inventories from some households, especially widows, that list personal objects without describing what they actually are. Sometimes they're called privates or women's tools, or even just wooden items of no value. But archaeologists have found a few such items preserved in peat bogs and under floorboards, and let's just say they're shaped in ways that leave very little to the imagination. Now, whether these objects were actually used for self-pleasure or had some other ritual or medicinal purpose. That's where the academic knives come out. Some scholars insist they were medical tools used to treat hysteria or encourage fertility. Others argue that if it walks like a dildo and hides like a dildo, it probably wasn't just for stirring porridge. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Multi-use tools in a world that didn't allow women to admit what they wanted, even to themselves. Wulfhild tells you she started experimenting when she was 17, after her first and only experience with a man left her more confused than satisfied. He grunted and rolled off, she shrugs, so I started figuring things out for myself. It wasn't about rebellion, she says, it was survival, solitude, sanity. You think men are the only ones who get restless in the dark? Her eyes glint with humour. You sit by the fire while she shows you how she warms the linen pouch in the ashes, then wraps it in a soft wool cloth to hold against her belly on cold nights. Sometimes it's just comfort, she murmurs. Other times it leads to something else. She doesn't elaborate, and you don't need her to. The room speaks for itself. Outside, owls call in the distance and the fire crackles softly. Wulfhild leans back, her face lit amber and gold. You can pray and still know your body, she says. They aren't enemies. They just don't speak the same language. And that right there is the line that breaks the centuries of silence. Because for all the church's fire and brimstone warnings and all the social controls layered onto women's bodies, the physical experience of pleasure was not erased. It was rerouted, repurposed, and sometimes hidden inside objects that, to the untrained eye, looked like nothing at all. Let's talk sensory detail because it mattered back then too. The texture of wool against bare skin warm from the fire, the pressure of a rounded wooden shape pressed between thighs under layers of linen. The scent of warm herbs, clove, fennel, and a trace of besan. These weren't just sensory details. They were the tools of survival for women whose lives were so often dictated by other people's rules. When pleasure couldn't be claimed publicly, it was carved in secret, into antler, stone, wood, and memory. The academic debate over these objects still rages on. Some historians downplay them as flukes, as misunderstood medical gear. Others lean into the idea that medieval women had a rich, if hidden, private life, where self-pleasure was known, practiced, and passed down in whispers. The fact that these objects have survived at all is enough to suggest they were treasured, hidden, and perhaps even mourned when lost. You thank Wulfhild and step out into the night. The air is cool now, but you feel a strange warmth that doesn't come from the fire. Maybe it's from knowing that even in the hardest eras, women found a way to reach themselves, through cloth and wood and stones that remembered the shape of joy. Maybe it's the realization that the tools of that joy were always in plain sight, just disguised as something else. The cottage behind you fades into the trees, but her words linger. You can pray and still know your body. That's the forgotten truth, not of rebellion or shame, but of a quiet autonomy. Of women crafting pleasure with whatever they had, spindle handles, warming stones, or their own patient hands. You're not quite ready to leave the woods just yet. Something about Wulfhild's confidence, her calm acceptance of solitude and satisfaction, sticks with you like smoke in your clothes. But tonight, your path curves back toward the stone walls of another abbey, one far more ornate than Juliana's simple cloister. This one's wealthier, positioned near a bustling trade route, its gardens lush and carefully trimmed, the windows set with coloured glass that catches the moonlight like sapphires and garnets. Inside, the air smells of rosewater, beeswax, and the subtle mildew of time. Here, behind the veil of discipline and daily prayer, women were writing things they weren't supposed to feel, let alone confess. In this particular abbey lived a nun named Gisela. Her writings didn't survive officially, no gold-leaf manuscript on display in a national archive. But fragments of her journal were discovered decades ago inside the hollow spine of a crumbling psalter, stuffed there like a guilty note. The parchment is faded, torn, water-damaged, but still legible in places, and what it reveals? Let's just say it's not all Ave Marias. You kneel beside the candlelit desk in Gisela's former cell. The space is bare, just a cot, a wooden chair, a bowl, and a small crucifix. But it's what lived in her head that matters. The journal fragments speak of nightly visitations, not of saints or demons, but of heat, of dreams that leave her gasping, of a wretched pleasure in the dark that she simultaneously begs forgiveness for and yearns to repeat. One line, jagged and slanted, reads, "I scourged myself but still found joy. May God forgive the flesh he gave me. It's raw, conflicted, kind of heartbreaking, and it tells a deeper story because Gisela wasn't alone." Across the medieval period, there's an entire category of writing historians call erotic mysticism. And sure, that sounds like a new age pop album, but it's actually a genre where visions of divine union are described in overtly sensual and sometimes sexually explicit language. Think saints gasping in ecstasy, being pierced by the love of Christ, experiencing waves of divine rapture that just so happen to sound a lot like, well, orgasms. Take St. Teresa of Avila's later writings, for example. Though she's post-medieval, her influence loomed retroactively. She describes being penetrated by the angel's fiery lance, her body quaking, her soul melted with divine love. Medieval mystics before her laid the groundwork for this. Hildegard of Bingen, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, and yes, many anonymous women in monasteries all reported bodily reactions to spiritual experiences. Trembling limbs, burning bellies, racing hearts. It raises a tough, uncomfortable question that scholars have been swatting at for years. Were some of these women channeling repressed sexual feelings into mystical language? Or were their bodies just reacting naturally, inevitably, to prolonged isolation, emotional intensity, and a life centered on longing? The debate is real. Some argue that to call these sensations erotic is an insult to their spirituality. Others say ignoring the eroticism is what erases their humanity. Because let's be honest, if your entire identity is built around yearning for something you're never allowed to physically touch, that longing's going to show up somewhere. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. In one 14th century convent in what's now modern-day Germany, a nun was discovered to have written not only devotional poetry, but also detailed letters to a fellow sister, ones describing intense dreams, physical sensations, and coded references to secret moments together. The letters were hidden in a cavity behind the altar, and only found centuries later during renovation, or were too damaged to read. But others survived. They were full of metaphors, gardens, doors, rivers, mouths, the kind of writing that only sounds innocent if you're trying really hard to miss the point. Tonight, as you sit on Gisela's cold wooden chair, you can almost feel the intensity of those women's inner worlds. Hours of silence, repetition, denial, and underneath it all, a body that refused to go quiet. The church said the body was a vessel of sin. These women lived with it anyway, and sometimes they touched it, not in rebellion, but in resentment, in search of peace, or relief, or some whispered, unspeakable kind of joy. The church, of course, tried to contain all this. They cracked down on anything that smacked of sensuality. Nuns were forbidden from sleeping in beds together. Touching, especially at night, was policed by older women known as mothers, nuns assigned to patrol the dormitories in case anything unholy was occurring beneath the sheets. But you can't patrol a dream, you can't watch what happens behind closed eyelids, and you definitely can't stop someone from discovering, in the quiet of their own cell, how to find the soft place where the ache dissolves into something warm and wordless. Gisela's journal ends abruptly. The last legible line is, "I will speak no more of this, but I will remember." It's unclear whether she was caught, confessed, or simply chose to stop writing. But the fact that she wrote at all tells you everything. She felt desire, she acted on it, and she recorded it not as filth, but as a part of her spiritual struggle, worthy of documenting. You leave the abbey just before dawn. The bells haven't rung yet. The world is holding its breath, and the candle in Gisela's cell flickers one last time behind you. Her story is just one among hundreds, maybe thousands of women who use spiritual language to process physical need, who blurred the lines between ecstasy and climax, who found ways, however quiet or coded, to know themselves inside skin the church told them to fear. And though we'll never know all their names, their sighs echo in the stone corridors, their secrets folded into prayer books, their joy hidden in plain view. You leave the abbey behind, the stone walls swallowed by morning mist, and walk through fields just beginning to glisten with dew. The silence of those cloistered lives hums in your bones, but now you're headed somewhere very different, somewhere far less sacred and far more scandalous. Tonight, or rather this morning, you're slipping between the pages of books that weren't meant to survive, the ones burned, banned, or bound in plain covers and shelved beneath false titles. You're stepping into the forgotten libraries of the Middle Ages, yes, they had those, and flipping open manuscripts with ink still sharp and intention still smouldering. Because guess what? Medieval women read erotica. Now, it is not like they had a section labelled Hot Nun on Nun Action, tucked between Lives of the Saints and agricultural manuals. But erotic literature existed, often imported, often disguised as classical or allegorical texts, and it circulated among those who could read and among those who couldn't, but had a friend who'd read it aloud in a whisper after dark. The line between entertainment, education and titillation wasn't as clear-cut as you might think. Take The Romance of the Rose, for instance, a massive 10th century French allegorical poem that starts out sounding innocent enough. A young man falls in love with a beautiful rosebud. Cute, right? Except the rosebud is obviously a vagina. The whole thing becomes an extended metaphor for seduction, resistance, and eventually conquest. And it was wildly popular, so popular in fact that women read it, copied it, passed it around, commented on it in the margins with half-laughing, half-scandalized notes. There's even a documented case of a noblewoman, Marguerite of Navarre, who not only read these kinds of stories but wrote her own. Her collection Heptameron is basically a medieval mashup of Canterbury Tales and Desperate Housewives, stories of passion, betrayal, lust and desire, told from multiple female perspectives. Some scholars say she was critiquing the hypocrisy of male sexual freedom. Others argue she was giving voice to female fantasies. Either way, her stories survived because they were written under the respectable mask of moral instruction. You had to squint, but the heat was there. And then there are the manuscripts no one wants to talk about. In 2008, a manuscript dating from the 14th century was found in the bindings of a larger legal volume. Parchment reused, stuffed into a spine to reinforce the cover. The discovered fragment, a narrative poem about a woman named Isabel who, after being locked in a tower by her jealous husband, finds solace not in prayer, but in a smooth device gifted to her by a maid. It's vague enough to escape immediate censorship, but direct enough to leave no doubt about what's happening. One line reads, "Her fingers knew the rhythm as well as any harpist's hand." Well then, here's your fringe fact for the day. There's speculation that certain guilds, especially those of scribes and illuminators, created erotic art on commission for private buyers. Not for public display, of course, but to be tucked into folios and hidden under mattress. In one rare example, a marginal illustration in a book of hours shows a nun chasing a phallus on legs. Yep, a literal penis with legs. It's not subtle. And while scholars debate whether it's satire or smut or some twisted moral allegory, the vibe is unmistakably cheeky. Someone somewhere found that funny or stimulating. Now you might be thinking, but weren't most women in the Middle Ages illiterate? Fair point. But here's the twist. Noble women, nuns, and urban merchant-class women were often literate, especially in larger towns. Reading wasn't always academic, it was social, sensual. Books were read aloud during embroidery circles, in bed, or while tucked away behind drawn curtains. One late 13th century account even tells of a group of nuns disciplined not for reading illicit texts themselves, but for allowing local girls into the convent to hear them read from French romances of excessive sweetness. That's a poetic way of saying they were reading sexy stories to guests after Vespers. But the debate rages on. Some scholars argue that we're misreading all this, that we're seeing sexual intent where none existed, that metaphors like the rose or the key and lock are just innocent allegories for spiritual longing. And yes, that's possible, but when those metaphors show up again and again, always attached to female readers, always circled or underlined or echoed in private notes, it's hard not to see a pattern. A longing not just for divine union, but for flesh and blood intimacy. Let's not forget that these women weren't reading in a vacuum. Their entire lives were structured around restraint. Physical desire was either ignored, punished, or pathologized. So when a story came along that even hinted at satisfaction, however veiled, it landed like a lit match on the dry straw. Imagine it. You're a widower with no husband to scold you, sitting in your candle-lit chamber, the curtains drawn. You open a book gifted by your cousin in Bruges. It's handwritten, carefully illustrated, and smells faintly of cloves and old leather. You turn the pages slowly. The story is about a woman, trapped, tempted, torn between duty and longing. And then, tucked inside a folded scrap, a hand-copied poem in French. She touched where no eyes dared to stray, and in the dark she found her day. Your fingers still on the page, your breath shallows. You know you're not supposed to feel like this. But here it is, a story written for you, or someone just like you. Proof that you're not alone, that someone else, a woman with ink on her hands and fire in her heart, knew what it was like to reach down alone in the dark and not feel shame, but a kind of quiet triumph. So no, erotica wasn't a modern invention, and women didn't start enjoying themselves in secret with the rise of paperback romances. They were doing it in castles, convents, and candlelit chambers centuries ago, with ink, imagination, and the will to find themselves in stories too dangerous to name. The real miracle? That any of those stories survived at all. By now you've wandered through convents and kitchens, poetry and herbs, whispered fantasies and carved curiosities, but tonight you're crossing a much darker threshold. The air smells different here. Damp earth, smoke, something acrid, almost like iron. You're entering the shadowy world where female pleasure and power collided with fear. This is where the story shifts from secrecy to danger, because for many women, the line between knowing their own bodies and being labelled a witch was thin, frayed, and often fatal. Let's start with the obvious question. Why was female sexuality so threatening that it ended up tangled with sorcery? The answer, as always, starts with control. In a world built on rigid hierarchies, God over man, man over woman, church over body, any woman who stepped outside of passivity was a problem. If she knew how to heal herself, that was suspicious. If she spoke confidently about the body, even more so. But if she took pleasure in that body, if she used that knowledge to feel good on her own terms, well, now you're into dangerous territory. Take the case of Sibylla, a midwife in the mid-15th century who lived near what's now Alsace. She was known in her village for being too direct, for never marrying, and for helping women in matters of the flesh. She brewed teas, massaged bellies, offered tinctures for pain. She also kept a small stone phallus, wrapped in red cloth, that she used, quietly, for treating women with what was then called uterine hysteria. You can guess what that actually meant. Her neighbours gossiped, then accused, and Sibylla was tried for witchcraft, not because she summoned demons, but because she laid hands upon women's lower regions and stirred unnatural heat. That was the phrasing used in the testimony. She was executed. Here's your quirky historical fact, the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, the late 15th century guidebook for identifying and punishing witches, includes entire sections obsessing over female sexuality. It claims, with absolute confidence, that women are more lustful, more deceitful, and more prone to carnal sin than men. One particularly unhinged passage describes how witches inflame the loins of others by the mere touch of the hand. Not exactly peer-reviewed science, but very telling. The fear wasn't just about magic, it was about women owning their own desire. You're starting to see a pattern, right? The church couldn't fully erase female pleasure, so it rebranded it, framed it as something foreign, demonic, outside the natural order. If a woman's body hummed with heat and joy, it had to be because she'd made a pact with the devil, or a forest spirit, or a goat for some reason. Anything except her own agency. But here's where things get murky. Some women did mix pleasure and ritual, not because they worshipped dark forces, but because the line between medicine, spirituality and sensuality wasn't clearly drawn. For example, in parts of rural France and Italy, fertility rites involved women bathing together, chanting prayers, anointing their bodies with oils, and yes, sometimes using carved objects passed between them to awaken the womb. These rituals were centuries old, rooted in pre-Christian traditions that the church absorbed, repackaged, or tried to erase. For the women, they were sacred, healing, maybe even ecstatic. Scholars argue about what exactly was happening during these rituals. Were they communal acts of empowerment, religious ceremonies with sensual overtones, or just misinterpreted folk practices? No one agrees. The sources are fragmented, often recorded by men who had no idea what they were actually witnessing, or who twisted it deliberately. But what's clear is this: the further a woman stepped from sanctioned roles, the more her pleasure became a threat. Picture this: a woman dancing alone in the woods at dusk, her hair loose, her feet bare in the dirt. She has herbs in her satchel, scars on her hands, and stories the priest doesn't like. If she touches herself under the moon, it's not because she's cursed, it's because she knows herself. That was enough. Inquisition records show that many women were accused not just of casting spells, but of arousing themselves, or others, through unnatural means. One case tells of a widow named Agnes who kept a devil's toy carved from bone and who supposedly used it during Sabbaths to entertain the flesh. There's no evidence she harmed anyone, but the object itself, proof that she sought pleasure without male permission, was all it took. The toy was burned along with her body. Let's take a breath, because this part is heavy. And yet through all of this, the trials, the gossip, the danger, women still found ways. They passed knowledge in hushed voices, shared tools under cloaks, hid items in wall crevices and inside mattress seams. One historian uncovered a tiny bundle of linen stuffed in a chimney of a 14th century cottage in Wales. Inside, a smooth wooden cylinder, a dried sprig of rosemary, and a prayer scroll addressed not to God, but to Our Lady of Comfort. No one knows her name. But we know what she valued: warmth, scent, sensation. A moment of control in a world that offered none. The debate continues today. Were these women rebels, victims, survivors, saints in disguise, or sensualists misunderstood? Some say we should stop trying to label them entirely, that what matters isn't how we categorize them, but how we listen to the traces they left. Scorched, hidden, whispered, you step away from the fire now, leaving behind the smoke and ashes of too many burned names. And yet you carry something with you, a deep understanding that pleasure, for many medieval women, was a dangerous act of resistance. To touch yourself in a world that told you your body wasn't yours, that was magic, the real kind, the kind no one could ever fully extinguish. You're walking through the thick fog of early morning now, and with each step the world feels heavier, not just from what's come before, witch hunts, whispers, burnings, but from what still hides in the cracks of this era. There's one more place you have to visit before sunrise. It's smaller than a village, quieter than a convent, and somehow more intimate than both. Tonight, you're stepping into the confessional, more specifically, into the space between the priest's questions and the woman's trembling voice. Because if you want to understand how medieval women experienced their own bodies, you need to listen not just to their desires, but to their confessions. Picture this: a simple wooden booth. The air smells of wax, mildew, and something sharper: fear. You're kneeling on the worn floorboards, the priest's silhouette just beyond the thin screen. You hear his breath before his words. Then comes the question, asked in Latin, French, or crude dialect, but always with the same tension. Have you touched yourself? It's not phrased quite like that, of course. It's usually couched in religious jargon. Have you entertained impure thoughts in solitude? Have you stirred your own flesh to sin? But the meaning is crystal clear. And across centuries, thousands of women answered, sometimes with silence, sometimes with tears, and sometimes with hesitant, shame-laced honesty. Which means the confessional, while designed to crush desire, also accidentally preserved it. You're reading one such confession now, tucked into an old manual used by parish priests in rural Spain. The handwriting is sloppy, probably copied by a tired cleric, but the story it records is vivid. A young girl, not yet 17, admits to pressing herself against the post of her bed during sleepless nights. She doesn't name it, she doesn't understand it, but she says it brought warmth, then shame. The priest marks her penance, 20 Hail Marys and fasting on Fridays. But between the lines, you can almost hear the girl's confusion. Her body felt something it wasn't supposed to, and instead of answers, she got punishment. This is where the real struggle played out, not just in secret acts of pleasure, but in the emotional aftermath. Because medieval women were taught that their bodies were not only sinful, but treacherous. Their desire was painted as something external, invasive, a temptation sent by demons or born from original sin. They were told their wombs wandered, if not filled, that their fluids were cold and dangerous unless regulated by sex or childbirth. So when they discovered pleasure on their own, it wasn't liberating, it was terrifying. And yet, they kept doing it. Why? Because instinct overrides ideology. Because the body doesn't care what the bishop thinks. Because sometimes, curiosity simply wins. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In a 13th century penitential guide from Flanders, priests are instructed to probe gently when questioning women, to avoid arousing further sin through the inquiry itself, which is medieval code for don't get too detailed or you might give them ideas. The absurdity, of course, is that the very act of grilling someone about their masturbation habits is going to put the idea front and centre. It's like telling someone not to imagine a naked saint, They're going to picture a naked saint, probably in detail, but the confessional wasn't just a site of punishment, it was also a twisted kind of catharsis. For many women, it was the only place they could speak of what they felt, even if it came with shame, even if it led to fasting, lashes, or isolation. At least they could say it out loud. There's a kind of relief in naming the thing, even if you whisper it through tears. You pause your walk now, finding yourself inside a small stone chapel on the edge of a crumbling town. The pews are empty, the air still. You sit in the dark, imagining the thousands of voices that pass through these walls, all speaking the same forbidden truths in different dialects. A peasant girl from a nearby farm who rubbed against the churn and wept after. A young noblewoman who confessed to dreams that left her soaked and shivering. A nun who admitted to restless nights and wandering hands, only to be moved to another abbey entirely. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns, echoes, a quiet chorus of bodies longing to be heard, even as they were taught to be silent. And here's the kicker. Most priests didn't know what to do with these confessions. Some assigned harsh penance, some brushed it off, and some wrote it down, not out of compassion, but fascination. Some even kept sin diaries, cataloguing the most lurid confessions. One such record, kept by a priest in 14th century Florence, included entries like, "A girl of 14 is frequent self-defilement using candle stubs," and "A woman of 35 admits to using the base of a crucifix." The tone is clinical, detached, but the fact that he recorded it again and again suggests something more than concern, maybe curiosity, maybe projection, maybe both. The scholarly debate here is messy. Some historians argue that we overinterpret these confessions, that the Church's obsession with sin doesn't reflect what people actually did, just what authorities feared. Others counter that the consistency of these records proves a lived reality. Women were masturbating us frequently, desperately, despite the shame, despite the risk, and why wouldn't they? Pleasure was one of the few things they could experience that wasn't dictated by a man. You didn't need permission, you didn't need a husband, or a priest, or a social position. Just a quiet moment, a hidden corner and a little imagination. Maybe a piece of smooth wood or the edge of a bed. Maybe nothing at all. Back in the chapel, you trace your fingers over the stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of knees and secrets. You imagine the last woman who knelt here. She might have been praying for forgiveness. Or maybe just for understanding. Maybe she whispered her confession through the screen, heart pounding, hoping the priest wouldn't hear the real weight in her voice. And maybe, once she'd said it, she went home and did it again, not because she was wicked, but because she was human. The sun's climbing now, turning the sky from grey to gold as you leave the chapel behind. It's still early, but you feel like you've lived a dozen lives already. Juliana and Gisela, Wulfhild and Aldith, their secret heavy in your pockets. But now it's time to step beyond the hearth and the abbey walls to where dust clings to your hem and blisters bloom on your feet. You're going on pilgrimage, not just in the spiritual sense, but in the deeply human one. Because medieval women didn't just travel for relics or redemption. Sometimes they walked hundreds of miles just to feel something they weren't allowed to name. Pilgrimage on the surface was a sacred journey, a long trek to a holy site undertaken to earn spiritual merit or atone for sin. And for women, it was one of the only socially acceptable reasons to leave home, move through the world alone, and brush up against strangers without raising suspicion. In theory, these journeys were about prayer and humility. In practice, they offered something far less pious and far more tantalizing: freedom, anonymity, the kind of solitude that lets the mind and hands wander. You're walking beside a young widow named Marjorie. She's headed for the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, a long and dusty trip from her home in Devon. She's grieving, or so she says, but as the road stretches behind her, she admits that she's also just curious. "I want to know what I'm made of," she tells you, eyes bright under her travel hood. "I've spent my life being touched. I wonder what it's like to touch myself." It sounds simple, but in her world, it's radical. You camp that night near a roadside inn, the stars blinking through the smoke of other pilgrims' fires. Marjorie rolls her cloak into a pillow and lies back with a content sigh. "I dream more now that I'm alone," she murmurs. "Not all of them are holy." She grins at the sky like it's in on the joke. She's not ashamed. Not exactly. But there's a thrill in the secrecy and a strange permission that comes from being just another face among many. And she's not the only one. Historical records tell us that women on pilgrimage often formed brief, intense bonds, sisters in walking, praying, and sometimes sinning. They shared food, shared blankets, shared stories that would have earned them lashes back home. And more than a few of those stories included confessions of heat that rose between thighs after long days on foot. One account from a 15th century Italian priest complains about wayward women pilgrims who lay alone too long and allowed their idle thoughts to breed devilish desires. He was scandalized, but also weirdly specific. Makes you wonder what he really saw or imagined. Here's your quirky historical footnote. At some shrines, vendors sold wax offerings shaped like body parts: hands, feet, hearts, and yes, genitals. Officially, these were offerings for healing, symbolic representations of ailments to be cured by the saint. But sometimes the wax figures were oddly exaggerated in detail. One particularly well-preserved example from a French site shows a pair of female legs, spread with something disturbingly lifelike nestled between them. It's been labelled anatomical offering, but the imagination fills in the rest. So what's the debate here? It's all about intent. Were these women acting out quiet rebellions through sacred ritual, or were these just strange little coincidences in a deeply symbolic world? Some historians argue that we're looking at medieval people through a modern lens, that we're reading sex into everything because we think about it constantly. Others point to the frequency, the consistency, and the sheer specificity of some of these records and say, come on, there's no way they didn't know what they were doing. You lean toward the latter, don't you? Let's say you're a woman with a life mapped out since birth. Marriage, childbirth, hard work, silence. And then, for once, you're alone. You walk for days, your body sore, raw, real. You feel it again in a way you haven't since girlhood. The curve of your hip as you wash in a stream. The pulse between your legs after miles of stepping over rocks and roots. You find yourself slipping a hand beneath your shift one night just to touch the ache that's grown there. It's not sinful, it's not even deliberate, it's instinctual. Your fingers know more than you do. Marjorie tells you she's brought something with her, a small cloth-wrapped stone smooth from river water that she keeps tucked in her bag. Helps with back pain, she says with a wink. But later that night, when the camp is quiet and only the insects hum, you hear the softest sound from where she lies, a slow, barely audible breath, drawn through teeth, a whisper of movement. She's tending to herself, in the dark, on a holy road. It's not sacrilegious, it's sacred in its own way. Pilgrimage offered women like Marjorie space to explore themselves, both spiritually and physically. It gave them time, distance, and a reprieve from constant surveillance, and for many that freedom translated directly into the body. Touching themselves wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was about finding the edges of their own skin, reclaiming sensation in a world that expected them to go numb. And let's not forget the shrines themselves. While official church doctrine tried to keep things clean and orderly, many pilgrimage sites developed reputations for being less than wholesome. There are accounts of excessive devotion, pilgrims fainting or writhing at the feet of saints, sometimes in what we would now recognize as states of religious ecstasy. And sure, some of that was genuine awe, but some of it looked suspiciously like physical release, especially when the stories started surfacing about women who recovered from hysteria after visiting particular altars and bathing in certain holy wells. Imagine that, travelling halfway across the country, offering a wax vulva to a saint, bathing in sacred spring water, and then lying in the dark, stroking away the years of romance and shame. If that's not spiritual healing, what is? You continue walking beside Marjorie, the road dusty beneath your feet and the horizon shimmering with light. She's humming now, low and steady, her fingers grazing the strap of her satchel. You don't ask her what she's thinking, you already know. She found herself somewhere along this road, not in a shrine or a sermon, but in the heat of her own hand, in the dream she didn't confess, in the stone that fits just right, and she's not going back. The road continues, winding past kumsus and hedgerows and low stone fences, till the spires of another town rise in the haze ahead. You've travelled far by now, through cloisters and kitchens, fields and firelight, but as you approach the town square, something shifts. This place smells of burnt sugar, wet leather, and politics. It's louder, full of trade and tension, and you can feel eyes watching from behind shutters. This is a town caught between sin and salvation, and at the centre of it all stands the towering figure of St. Agnes, carved in pale stone, her expression frozen somewhere between agony and rapture. Tonight, you're walking the blurred line between sainthood, sin, and sensuality. Because medieval women weren't just imagining pleasure in secret, they were witnessing it in their saints. The divine and the erotic weren't always opposites. Sometimes they shared a bed. It sounds wild, but hear this. Countless hagiographies, those are the official lives of the saints, contain descriptions that sound more like feverish love letters than holy biographies. Female saints, in particular, are often described experiencing physical ecstasy. They swoon, they shudder. They fall to the floor in tears, trembling with what the texts call divine joy. And if that all sounds suspiciously familiar to you, yeah, same. Take St. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century mystic, deeply revered, canonized within a century of her death. Her most famous writings include descriptions of a mystical marriage to Christ in which she receives an invisible ring, symbolic, yes, but she also writes of feeling pierced by love, overcome by sweetness, and seized by trembling. Her confessor describes her lying still for hours, her face flushed, her breathing shallow. It was called holiness. But let's be real, if that same scene were written in a modern novel, it would come with a steamy warning, even more striking as St. Teresa of Avila, though yes, she technically lived after the medieval period. Still, her influence was already forming. Her vision of being pierced by a flaming arrow from an angel, her body writhing with divine bliss. She literally wrote, "The pain was so intense that I moaned aloud, yet it was not bodily pain, but spiritual delight so sweet that one never wishes it to end." The line between spirit and body didn't just blur, it completely dissolved. Now here's the quirky wrinkle. For centuries, many of these descriptions were taken completely at face value. Holiness was seen as something that could be so intense it overwhelmed the senses. But in recent decades, scholars have started asking, was that really all it was? Some suggest these women were channeling unexpressed sexual energy into religious devotion. Others argue that we're projecting modern ideas backward, that these saints were simply swept up in emotional intensity. But the undeniable fact, many of these mystical experiences involved the body. They were described in the language of arousal. They weren't just theological. They were visceral. And what about the women reading these stories? Imagine you're a merchant's daughter. You've just been given a devotional manual by your furu, meant to keep you pious, obedient, chaste. Inside, you find the life of St. Agnes, who reportedly refused a marriage proposal, ran into the woods, prayed for divine union, and lay trembling in the moss, overcome with warmth. You read it again and again, and something stirs. You're not thinking about doctrine, you're thinking about that warmth, that trembling, that moss. Because maybe these stories weren't just instructions, maybe they were invitation. Some nuns reportedly read the lives of the saints not just for spiritual growth, but for comfort. And comfort, in a world where every form of bodily autonomy was stripped away, could easily become desire. The most radical part? In those rare moments when a woman's physical longing was framed as mystical, it was respected, even venerated. No one questioned St. Teresa's gasps, or Hildegard's visions, or Mechtild's burning belly. So maybe, just maybe, women started folding their real flesh and blood longing into the language of the divine, not to deceive, but to survive. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. There are documented cases, scattered, half erased, of women performing rituals in front of saintly icons that look suspiciously sensual. Candles placed between thighs, prayers whispered, with hands pressed low. A priest in Cologne wrote a furious sermon about women who fell into raptures before the Virgin's altar and touched themselves in their robes, claiming to feel divine warmth. He tried to ban the practice, but it kept happening, which leads to the big scholarly debate. Were these women faking religious ecstasy to experience pleasure without punishment, or were they genuinely feeling something that was both sacred and sensual? Some historians argue that we're trying too hard to separate the two, that in the medieval mind, spiritual and bodily experiences weren't always at odds. A woman didn't have to choose between the bedroom and the chapel. Sometimes they overlapped. You wander the edge of the town square now, watching the bustle slow as dusk approaches. You pass a candlemaker's shop where a young woman stacks moulds shaped like hands and hearts, but also other suggestive forms. One could be a limb, or something more private. She catches your eye, smirks, and doesn't explain. She doesn't need to. There's a quiet understanding there. Back at the shrine of St. Agnes, a line has formed. Women of all ages kneel at her feet, praying. Some sob, some smile, some sit perfectly still. One woman leans forward, places her forehead against the cold marble, and stays there a little too long. Her shoulders shake, not in grief, but something else. She walks away lighter. This is the space medieval women carved out for themselves, between the holy and the hungry, a place where they could long reach, tremble, and still be seen as good, faithful, worthy. They knew the rules, and they found the cracks. They wrapped desire in velvet language, placed it in the mouths of saints, and let it live. And maybe later that night, after the shrine is dark and the candles have burned low, that same woman will lie in her narrow bed, fingers exploring the divine geography of her own body, whispering prayers with every soft sigh. Not as rebellion, not even as release, but as recognition. She is not separate from the sacred. She is sacred. The streets of the town are quiet now, the day's merchants long packed up, carts creaking homeward and shutters drawn tight. You're moving past the cathedral, past the bells that keep everyone's lives stitched to a schedule, and into the winding back lanes where the real stories breathe, among the timbered homes of merchants, bakers, and housewives. Tonight, you're stepping into one of those homes. Not noble, not poor, just ordinary. Because if you want to understand how medieval women pleasured themselves, you can't just look at saints and sinners. You have to sit at the kitchen table, stare into the stew pot, and listen to the woman who stirred it. Her name is Alice, and she lives 3 streets from the market in a narrow house with ivy creeping up the bricks and a drying rack full of onions above the hearth. She has 3 children, a husband who travels for business, and the look of someone who hasn't had a moment to herself in a decade. But when the house sleeps, when the shutters are latched and the fire's nothing but warm coals, she changes. She stops being a provider, a cleaner, a caretaker, and becomes something else entirely. Someone who remembers her body still belongs to her. The concept of housewife is so often flattened in modern memory, but back then it came with complexity. These women ran households like empires. They brewed beer, kept accounts, bartered cloth, doctored wounds, and raised children with no help but their own hands. They were resourceful, exhausted, and, here's the thing, they were often alone. Alone during the day while the men worked the fields, alone during long business trips, alone in the long silent hours of a snowed-in night. And where there is solitude, desire is never far behind. Alice doesn't say much. She doesn't have to. You see it in the way she straightens the linen on the bed when no one's watching, how she places the oil lamp in just the right corner to cast a gentle, warming glow. She tells you her favourite time of year is early spring, not because of the weather, but because of the privacy. With the kids helping outside and her husband at the port, the afternoons are hers. She doesn't read Latin, doesn't write poetry, but she knows what feels good, and she's inventive. Alice shows you a drawer. Inside, small scraps of softened leather, a rounded bit of driftwood, polished smooth by river water, a pouch of dried lavender mixed with chamomile and a whisper of mint. Helps with nerves, she says, though her smirk says otherwise. These aren't tools of rebellion. They are tools of survival. Little rituals for the body when the world demands too much from it. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. In some medieval marriage handbooks, yes, those existed, there are entire chapters devoted to how women should endure sex with their husbands. Not enjoy, endure. Yet between the lines, advice sneaks through. Prepare the bed with warmth and oils, one 14th century guide advises. Let her recline gently and breathe deeply, for her pleasure quickens her womb. That last part, if you caught it, is the loophole. If a woman's enjoyment was seen as helpful to fertility, then suddenly it was permissible, even encouraged. So Alice plays along. When she touches herself at night, she sometimes tells herself it's medicinal, preventative, necessary. She doesn't need a scholar's footnote to justify it, but she's savvy enough to use one if she ever got caught. Keeps the blood from going sour, she jokes, and it's quicker than waiting for God to answer a prayer. Outside, the wind stirs the shutters, and a soft creak echoes through the rafters. Inside, Alice has settled under her wool blanket, one hand wrapped around a warmed pouch of herbs, the other drifting with purpose. She's not hiding from herself, not anymore. Let's pause here because this is the part of the story that rarely makes it into history books. Most of what we know about medieval female pleasure comes from religious documents, medical texts, or accusations, basically men's commentary on women. But Alice's story isn't in any record. It's preserved in the smoothness of her driftwood, the faint perfume in her drawers, the muscle memory in her fingertips. You can't archive that, but it's real, and it challenges the narrative. This wasn't about sin, or scandal, or even escape. It was about returning to the body after a day of serving others, returning to sensation after silence, returning to a version of herself that didn't ask for permission. Scholars have debated whether peasant and merchant class women had time or space for self-pleasure. They were too busy, some argue, too constrained by duty. But that argument forgets one thing: even the busiest lives have cracks, slivers of time when no one's watching, when the house is still. And in those moments the body whispers. Alice listens. She tells you softly that she first discovered pleasure as a girl accidentally during a bath. The way the water moved, the way the heat pooled low in her belly, it startled her. She thought she'd done something wrong. She didn't tell her mother, but she remembered. Later she learned to chase that feeling. Not often, not obsessively, but just enough to remind herself she was alive. It wasn't until years later, after childbirth and years of marriage, that she needed it again. This time not out of curiosity, but out of survival, to feel herself again beneath the layers of obligation. So now, when the chance comes, she lets her hands wander. She knows what makes her body sing, and when she finishes, she breathes, not in guilt, not in fear, but in relief, in reclamation. This is the version of history no one teaches you, the one without martyrdom or miracle, just a woman in a small town in a small bed, remembering what it feels like to belong to herself. A woman who doesn't need Latin or liturgy to justify her pleasure. She just needs time, and when she gets it, she takes it. It's near midnight now, and the hearth fire in Alice's house has burned down to a soft red glow. You slip out quietly, leaving behind the scent of mint and smoke and the gentle breath of someone who has finally claimed a sliver of rest. The streets are empty, slick with dew, and the town feels like it's holding its breath. But you're not headed home just yet. There's one more door waiting to open tonight, and behind it lies a different kind of power, one practiced with clean hands, sharp tools, and ancient knowledge. The midwife's domain. You find her in a house that doesn't quite look like a home. There's no family bustling around, no husband warming his feet by the fire. Just shelves, crates, jars. And a woman in her 40s, sleeves rolled, apron stained, her fingers smelling faintly of vinegar and thyme. Her name is Marga. She's delivered dozens of babies, stitched dozens of tears, and laid out dozens of the dead. People trust her, or fear her, or both. Either way, they come. But what they don't know or don't say aloud is that Marga has also kept another set of knowledge, not just about childbirth or fever, but about pleasure, about the moments in a woman's life when her body doesn't ache, or bleed, or stretch to accommodate others, but tightens with her own desire. And she shares that knowledge, carefully, in whispers and hands-on guidance disguised as treatment. Tonight she's seeing a young woman named Linné, newly married, pale with embarrassment. She came under the pretense of irregular bleeding, but once the door closes, her real reason stumbles out. "I can't finish," she says, cheeks blazing. "Not with him, not by myself. I thought maybe something's wrong." Marga doesn't laugh. She never does. She simply nods, draws the curtain, and pulls down a small leather pouch. Inside are herbs, yes, but also something else. A soft bundle of cloth. A smooth, curved object made from antler and wrapped in waxed linen. Marga calls it the moonstone, though it's neither a stone nor magical. What it is, however, is tried and true. "Let me show you how to listen," she says gently, "and your body will speak." This, right here, is the hidden legacy midwives carried, decapitated beyond blood and bone. They weren't just healers, they were keepers of erotic anatomy. They knew what books didn't teach, what priests refused to name. They touched, examined, comforted, and, yes, educated. And often that education included pleasure. Let's talk fringe fact. In a 14th century manuscript on gynecological health translated from Arabic medical sources, there's a short, careful passage describing how to relax the womb through stimulation. It outlines the process in clinical terms. Massage the lower abdomen with warming oil, apply gentle pressure, allow release. It stops just short of calling it what it is, assisted orgasm. And who is performing these treatments? Midwives, quietly, compassionately, and often repeatedly. Some historians bristle at the idea. They argue it's anachronistic to assume medieval midwives understood or encouraged masturbation, that these treatments were just misinterpretations of hysteria relief or fertility techniques, but others say the pattern is too clear. The objects found in apothecary kits. The repeated mentions of womb massage, the coded notes in herbal texts, it all suggests a deeper, tactile wisdom, one passed from hand to hand, not pen to page. Back in Marga's cottage, Lynette listens carefully. She watches, she mimics, her breath quickens. She's not being violated, judged, or rushed. She's being taught, not by a lover fumbling in the dark, but by another woman who knows exactly how the body blooms under its own touch. When Lynette finally finds that moment, the soft gasp, the inward curling, she cries, not because it hurts, but because it doesn't. For the first time, pleasure feels safe, feels hers. Marga says nothing, just hands her a warm cloth and a packet of herbs to take home. Use this when the world makes you forget what you are, she says. And just like that, a life changes. You sit with Marga after Lynette leaves, the candlelight flickering off jars filled with dried roots and hand-carved tools. They all think I just birth babies, she mutters, sipping from a chipped cup. But I help women birth themselves too. No one thanks you for that, but they come back. She shows you her ledger, a mess of names, notes, symbols. Next to some entries, you see a tiny crescent moon drawn in charcoal. You ask, she smiles. That means they remembered their own body, she says. Most forget. Life has a way of wearing it out of you. There's no official record of this side of midwifery. No sanctioned scrolls. No statues or stained glass tributes. But if you read between the lines of medical texts, if you open the hidden drawers in dusty cottages, you find the traces. A broken comb filed into shape. A jar of oil that smells more like jasmine than medicine. A hand-sketched diagram of the pelvis with parts labelled in a mix of Latin and local slang. Nothing academic, everything human. The debate, as usual, splits down familiar lines. Was this knowledge widespread or rare? Did women like Marga share openly or only with those desperate enough to ask? We may never know, but the very fact that such knowledge existed, rooted in care, in empathy, in bodily autonomy, is proof of something powerful, something enduring. Marga tells you she once treated a noblewoman who travelled 2 days in secret to find her. She said she hadn't felt anything in 5 years, Marga recalls, not even when she tried, not even in her dreams. By the time she left, she was humming under her breath. You leave Marga's house just before dawn. The air has that peculiar weight it gets right before a storm, dense, charged. Ready to break, you know you've just witnessed something horrid, no less so for being entirely unsanctioned. A passing on of knowledge not recorded in ink but in sensation, in trust, in the fingertips of women who had no books but knew the shape of pleasure better than any scholar ever would. And somewhere across the town, Lynette lies awake in her marital bed, one hand wrapped in cloth, the other pressed low, discovering that she is not broken after all, that there is nothing sinful about knowing herself, that she doesn't need a priest's pardon to feel whole, she just needed someone to show her the way back. You're walking again, this time down a muddy path that weaves out of town and into the edge of the woods, where everything feels a little more ancient, a little less watched. The trees hang close here like gossiping neighbours. Moss covers everything that doesn't move and even some things that do. You're headed towards something unspoken, something left out of most official records, but very much present in the lives of medieval women. Because now, it's time to talk about the object that everyone pretended didn't exist, even as it passed from hand to hand in the dark, the dildo. Yes, that one. Let's just say it plainly. You may think of the dildo as a modern invention, rubber, silicone, electric, but the idea of using a shaped object for personal stimulation is far older than plastic and power cords. In fact, the word itself dates back to at least the early modern period, with roots possibly tied to Italian diletto, delight, or even the Old English dilden, a term for thrusting. But the thing itself, that existed long before anyone wrote a polite word for it. You find yourself now inside a stone cottage near the woods, candles flickering against the soot-stained walls. The woman who lives here, Ideni, is a widow in her 50s, quiet, sharp-eyed, known in her village for being odd but useful. She grows rare herbs, sells eggs, carves spoons, and among her collection of wooden trinkets and polished tools is something not quite shaped like a spoon. It sits in a box beneath her bed, wrapped in wool and smelling faintly of beeswax. She doesn't show it off, but she doesn't hide it either, not when she sees you've come to understand. It's pine, she tells you, smoothed for years. Wasn't always for this, but things evolve. It's not anatomically precise, no detailing, no flair, but it's shaped for purpose and it's seen use. She oils it now and then, keeps it wrapped, cleans it carefully. Some say it's sinful, she mutters, but those are usually people who don't know what to do with themselves in the dark. She chuckles, but there's history in her voice, long nights, long marriages, longer silences. This doesn't talk back, doesn't take, just gives. You pause, because here's the thing, dildos in the Middle Ages are rarely mentioned in writing, and almost never by name. They're hidden in euphemism, metaphor, and implication. But they're there. There are legal records from the 15th century where women are prosecuted for using devices made in the likeness of male members on themselves or others. One such case from France involves two women who lived together, shared a bed, and were accused of impersonating the marital act with false instruments. The object was seized, described in court as wooden, warmed, and indecently shaped. The women were punished. The object burned. So yes, they existed. They were feared, and they were used. Your quirky historical footnote for the night. In a preserved inventory list from a mid-14th century Italian noblewoman's estate, there's a curious entry, una figura di legno, ben levigata, per usanza privata. Translation: a wooden figure, well smoothed for personal use. No further details, no justification, just tucked in among the jewellery, the gloves, the books. A quiet admission that pleasure had a place, even in the polished world of the elite. But what about ordinary women? Well, here's where we hit the edge of the surviving evidence. We don't have a treasure trove of labelled medieval sex toys. What we do have are stories, half remembered, half erased, of women like Ideni. Women who worked with wood or horn or bone, women who carved things under the guise of tools, women who shaped objects for therapeutic use or womb stimulation. The scholarly debate is whether these items were genuinely for pleasure or had purely medicinal purposes. But again, it's about the context. When something is shaped just so, kept hidden just there, and cared for just that way, well, you can draw your own conclusions. Ideni runs a cloth across the grain of her tool, checking it for roughness. Can't have splinters, she says, deadpan. That's one way to ruin an evening. Then, after a pause, I've made a few for others, quietly, a sister-in-law, a lonely seamstress, once for a woman who said she just liked the weight of it in her hands. She looks up, half challenging. They never come back to complain, and here's the heart of it. In a world where female sexuality was either denied or demonized, the dildo was an artifact of defiance. It didn't need permission. It didn't belong to a man. It didn't reproduce or obey or confess. It pleasured, silently, steadily, in secret. That's probably why they were so feared. Not for their shape, but for their autonomy. A woman who could satisfy herself didn't need a husband. A woman who understood her own pleasure might question the rest of the rules, and the church, along with the state, didn't like women who questioned anything. Still, the objects persisted, passed hand to hand, hidden in boxes, buried under floorboards, disguised as cooking tools or medical devices, never named directly because naming would have made them real, and real things are harder to burn. Ideni leans back in her chair, the firelight catching her grey braid. You know what's funny? She asks. I've prayed with one hand and pleasured with the other. Never felt like the Lord minded either way. You don't laugh, you just nod. Because by now you understand the layers of that statement, the decades of silence behind it, the certainty earned through touch and time that the divine and the sensual were never enemies, just two sides of a coin that the world refused to flip. You step back out into the woods as the wind picks up, rustling the canopy above. The path feels different now, like you're walking with the knowledge of something that was never supposed to survive, but did. Not in texts, not in sermons, but in carved pine and calloused hands. in the steady rhythm of women who found pleasure on their own terms and didn't wait for permission to reach it. They didn't need a name for it, they just needed to feel real. You leave the woods with the whisper of pine still clinging to your clothes and step back into the lanes of a small village nestled along the edge of open farmland. This place feels older than old, not because of its age, but because of what it keeps hidden in plain sight. Stone walls draped in moss, thatched roofs sagging with rain, narrow doorways built just wide enough for one. You're here not for a person this time, but an object, or more accurately a pattern, woven across the tapestries that hang in homes, abbeys and halls. Tonight you're staring at the threads, because sometimes history doesn't whisper, it weaves. Inside one low cottage, you meet Joan, a woman who spins flax and dyes wool with walnut husks and onion skins. Her hands are the colour of bark, and her back bends slightly from years at the loom. She's quiet, practical, and the kind of person you'd overlook unless you knew what you were looking for. On the far wall of her home hangs a large woven tapestry. A pastoral scene, nothing scandalous at first glance. There's a shepherd, a tree, a river, all very pious, very safe, until you look closer. One vine wraps around the trunk in a perfect spiral, its tip curls just so, suspiciously suggestive. The shepherdess's fingers are oddly positioned on her spindle, and those sheep, a bit too interested in the knotted roots beneath the trees. It doesn't scream erotic, it smirks it. This was a language of its own. During the Middle Ages, embroidery and tapestry weren't just decoration, they were storytelling, documentation, and in some cases, rebellion. And women, especially those confined to the domestic sphere, spent hours stitching. Long days, aching fingers, minds wandering. Some of those minds stitched prayers, others something far cheekier. Let's talk about the Bayeux tapestry. Yes, that one. The one that chronicles the Norman conquest. Technically not a tapestry at all, it's embroidery. But that's beside the point. What matters is what hides in its margins. Tiny, almost cartoonish scenes. A naked man squatting, a woman lifting her skirts, various appendages appearing where they shouldn't. Scholars have long debated what these images mean. Are they warnings, jokes, winks to the viewer? Maybe all of the above. And then there's the practice of samplers, smaller embroidery pieces made by women to show their skill. Most are filled with biblical verses, floral patterns, or moral sayings. But now and then, one turns up with curious additions. A flower that looks suspiciously like vulva, a bird beak diving into petals, a pair of hands holding something unidentifiable but somehow unmistakably phallic. These weren't accidental. They were coded messages, stitched in secrecy, passed from woman to woman, hanging in bedrooms behind curtains or tucked into dowries as private jokes, or maybe quiet testaments to personal discovery. Your quirky fringe fact for this chapter: in 1992, a sampler dating to the late 15th century was discovered behind a false panel in a Devon manor house. It featured a garden scene, a tower, and a maiden kneeling. Innocent, right? Until scholars looked closer and realized the tower was distinctly phallic, and the maiden's prayer looked a lot more like a masturbation posture than a devotional one. One stitcher's little rebellion, preserved for 500 years. Back in Joan's cottage, she tells you that every woman learns her own stitch eventually. The men don't look twice, she says. They just see a lamb or a vine. But we know. We always know. She points to another tapestry, one she keeps rolled beneath her bed. This one is more direct. It shows a tree with long drooping fruit. Beneath it, a woman sits with her skirts lifted, face turned skyward, hand between her thighs. The fruit above her is bursting open. The threads are a bit frayed, but the intent is unmistakable. There's truth in thread, Joan mutters. Keeps your fingers busy and your secrets safe. She tells you about a friend, long gone now, who stitched an entire piece of linen full of barely hidden acts of self-pleasure, hands under skirts, women bathing together, fruit dripping juice, and sewed it into the hem of her wedding sheet. Her husband never noticed, but she knew it was there, beneath them, every night. A reminder that she still belonged to herself. This raises the scholarly debate, of course. Some historians argue that the erotic interpretations of medieval embroidery are modern projections, that what looks sexual to us might have simply been natural symbolism, fertility references, or even misunderstood plant forms. but others say the repetition, the placement, and the intentional ambiguity are exactly the point. That women used a visual language because they couldn't speak the words. They weren't writing books, they weren't carving wood, they had thread, so they used it. You walk with Joan to the edge of a small orchard just outside the village. On a faded linen cloth, she shows you a newer piece she's been working on. It's just a collection of herbs, mugwort, valerian, yarrow, but if you tilt your head, the curves start to resemble something else, something softer, something secret. She doesn't confirm, she just smiles and says, "The body has its own symbols, some of us just learn how to stitch them." And that's what this is, a silent archive of women's pleasure, hidden in border designs and floral motifs, not loud, not lewd. Just quiet reminders that even in domestic labour, even in spaces meant to keep them contained, women found ways to express what they couldn't say. They stitched desire into vines, they embroidered longing into petals, they wrapped their private joy in linen, folded it and placed it carefully into drawers. That's the real rebellion, making something beautiful from something forbidden. As you leave Joan's cottage, the sky's beginning to pale, the horizon blushes with early light, like a body just beginning to stir, and behind you, in a house filled with wool and stories, a tapestry hangs crooked on the wall, just enough to keep the secret safe. The morning light slides slow and golden over the fields as you follow a winding path toward the edge of the manor district, where the houses get larger, the stone walls higher, and the fabrics hanging from windows just a bit too fine to be practical. It's a place of hierarchy where even the breeze feels filtered. But you're not here for lace and titles. You're here for what's hidden beneath all of it. Because sometimes, the most forbidden pleasures weren't behind monastery walls or buried under straw. They were stitched into sleeves, brushed across skin, woven into the very cloth a woman wore. Welcome to the world of sensual fabric. You step into the private chamber of Lady Cecily, a noblewoman of 38 whose husband is off negotiating something political and whose children are with the wet nurse. The room smells like beeswax polish, crushed lavender, and the faint, dizzying sweetness of imported spices. The tapestries here aren't suggestive, at least not like Joan's. They're grand, more full of saints and allegories. But what catches your eye isn't the wall, it's the bed, or more specifically, the silk laid over it. Cecily watches you look. She knows. The silk is deep red and impossibly soft. Expensive, rare, the kind of fabric that takes months to make and could buy a small cottage if sold on the right day. She tells you she requested it specially. For warmth, she says, though there's not a chill in the air. Then she picks up a second piece, black velvet edged in silver thread. This one, she says slowly, pressing it to her cheek, feels like breath. She's not being poetic, she's being honest. In the medieval world, fabric wasn't just fashion, it was sensation. And for women, especially those of means, certain fabrics became conduits for pleasure. Sumptuary laws restricted who could wear what, monsieur? Often forbidding commoners from using velvet, silk, or fur. Why? Because those fabrics mattered. They clung to the body, they moved against the skin, they aroused. There are records of women, particularly noble women, lining their undergarments with fur, not for warmth, but for intimate contact. The soft brush of rabbit or squirrel fur on inner thighs, not an accident, not when you could afford linen and wool for warmth. This was intentional, hidden, unspoken, but very much felt. Cecily lifts the hem of her chemise to show a patch of cloth sewn near the hip, white silk, thin as breath. Sometimes, she confesses, when the days are long and I'm alone, I sit still and let it move across me. She doesn't finish the sentence. She doesn't have to. Your quirky fact of the evening. In a 15th century French inventory of a noblewoman's belongings, there's mention of a lining of velvet sewn discreetly into the bed linen for nocturnal rest. Now, we could pretend that's about comfort. But velvet is hot, heavy, and suffocating if used purely for sleeping, unless you weren't planning on sleeping, unless your bed linen was doing more than keeping you warm. So what do the scholars say? Some dismiss these accounts as misinterpretations, practical luxury, not sensual subversion. But the theirs point to the frequency of these choices. Velvet inner linings, fur-trimmed shifts, silk that barely covered anything at all. They argue that women were using fabric not just to dress themselves, but to feel themselves. And in a world where pleasure couldn't be spoken, touch became the language of resistance. Cecily tells you about her favourite robe, dyed indigo lined with otter fur. weighted just enough to press against her body as she walks. If I move slowly, she says, it wraps me like a hand. She laughs, low in her throat. Sometimes I don't even have to do anything else. And here's where the conversation gets even more interesting. In private letters, especially those between women, there are mentions of the blush-coloured lining or that sleeve that feels like breath. These weren't just aesthetic comments. They were code, a language of texture, temperature, and subtlety that allowed women to discuss pleasure without ever using the word. One noblewoman writes to her sister in a letter preserved in a 14th century collection, "The new velvet chemise you sent me is distracting. I thank you. I wear it often when I'm meant to pray. That's not about fashion, that's about feeling." You sit on Cecily's bed as she runs her fingers down a bolt of silk. She tells you she used to think pleasure had to come from someone else, her husband, a lover, a poem, but one afternoon while trying on a new garment, she felt a shiver from the fabric alone. "It slid across me," she says, "and I realised I don't need anyone to touch me. I can feel this and remember I'm alive." And this opens the door to an entire world of private rituals. Women wore certain fabrics on certain days. Some lined their undergarments with rose petals soaked in honey water. Some chilled their linens before pressing them to warm thighs. Some, like Cecily, simply wrapped themselves in silk and let the texture do what years of silence and marriage had not, awaken them. But the debate endures. Did these women know what they were doing? Or were they just enjoying comfort, blissfully unaware of the erotic undercurrent? Maybe both. Maybe they didn't have the language to explain it, but their bodies understood. And sometimes the body leads where words won't follow. You stand now, letting your hand brush across Cecily's silk bedspread. It's soft, yes, but it's also heavy, grounding, like it remembers every hand that's touched it and every thought that's lingered beneath it. She watches you closely, then says, "Take some. Just a piece. Keep it near your skin, you'll see." And you believe her. Because fabric, like memory, can hold more than what it seems. It can be both shield and key. It can wrap a woman in softness when the world only offers hardness. It can bring joie in silence, in slowness, in secret. As you leave her chamber, you feel the smooth silk tucked inside your sleeve pressed against your wrist like a promise, and you realise that even in the most proper places, where everything looks controlled and holy and clean, desire lives. Sometimes not in moans or motion, but in the brush of cloth against bare skin. And the woman who wears that cloth, she knows. You leave the manor district behind, the memory of silk lingering on your skin like a ghost. It follows you through the shifting light of day, down a hill toward a smaller settlement where the air smells like barley mash and tanned leather. This place is less polished, more practical. Homes are tighter together, livestock wanders freely, and voices carry easily across the square. But you're not here for the noise, you're here for the silence, the ones preserved in ink, in careful script and well-meaning diagnoses, between the lines of men who thought they understood the female body but really didn't. Today you're cracking open the medical texts. You step into the stone-walled house of a barber surgeon named Arno, where scrolls and codices lie open across a splintering desk. He's a local physician of sorts, not university-trained, but well-read, respected, and just detached enough to write about women without actually speaking to many of them. He offers you a chair beside his cluttered writing bench and gestures to the open manuscript. "De secretis mulierum," he says, "on the secrets of women. Quite useful. Ah, yes, that one." Originally attributed to a medieval scholar named Albertus Magnus, though most experts now believe it wasn't written by him at all. De secretis mulierum was a wildly popular text throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. It promised to explain the mysteries of the female body, menstruation, conception, pregnancy, and yes, sexuality. But what it mostly did was get things hilariously, outrageously wrong. According to the text, women's bodies were cold, wet, and inferior to men's, because of course they were. It explains that a woman's desire originates in the womb, which is prone to wandering if left unsatisfied. Yes, the infamous wandering womb theory. Masturbation, then, wasn't just sinful, it was dangerous. It might excite the womb, which could then float upward and cause suffocation, madness, or death. You blink. Arno shrugs. That's why we prescribe a marriage, or leeches. Of course, it's easy to laugh until you realise how deeply this kind of misinformation shaped women's lives. These medical beliefs weren't fringe, they were mainstream. They informed how priests treated confessing women, how midwives were instructed to manage hysterical episodes, how husbands were told to pacify their wives if they showed signs of discontent, often through sex, but not necessarily through affection. Here's your quirky historical fact. A 14th century Italian physician named Taddeo Alderotti described a treatment for women suffering from melancholia of the womb that involved stimulating the genitals with warm compresses, herbs and gentle friction, ideally performed by a trusted female assistant. Sounds like a spa day, or a very old-school vibrator session, but of course, it was never described as pleasure, it was treatment. And therein lies the twist. Medical texts often framed masturbation, especially female masturbation, as both a disease and a cure. It was wrong if a woman did it on her own, uncontrolled, hidden, but if it was prescribed, if it came with the right herbs, the right gloves, under the guise of restoring balance. Suddenly it was medicine. That's the scholarly debate in a nutshell. Were these male-authored remedies actually unspoken acknowledgements of female sexuality? Or were they oblivious attempts to medicalize things they didn't understand? You lean over Arnaud's shoulder and read a case study he's copied. A woman in her 20s, no name given, complains of tightness in the belly, restlessness, heat between her thighs. She's advised to release the humours through a sequence of hot poultices, oil massages, and pressure applied to the gate of pleasure. It's written clinically, coldly, but it's impossible to ignore what's really happening here. Someone prescribed her a guided orgasm, with all the bedside manner of a tax accountant. And not all treatments were hands-on, some were herbal. Arnaud hands you a satchel of dried Damiana leaves, rosemary and crushed fennel. This is for womb stirrings, he explains. Calms the blood, encourages movement. You imagine how many women drank such teas with a knowing smile. They didn't need to read Latin to feel what was happening. They just needed to know their own bodies. But not every woman welcomed these remedies. For many, the shame ran deep. Centuries of sermons and scoldings had taught them that any desire was a deviation. So when the treatments worked, when the pressure and heat and friction brought them relief, they panicked, they confessed, they fasted, and some of them were punished for experiencing the very pleasure that their doctors had prescribed. This is where Arnaud looks most uncomfortable. He's not cruel, just clueless. Like most physicians of the time, he knows how to describe symptoms but not sensations. It's not about pleasure, he insists. It's about restoring balance. He doesn't realize that for a woman who has spent her life being told her body is sinful, balance can feel a lot like joy, and that joy can feel like sin. You glance around his workspace, diagrams of the female reproductive system drawn with more imagination than accuracy. A jar labelled womb salt, a bronze tool shaped oddly. Arnaud calls it a dilator, but the smooth rounded end and the polished handle tell you otherwise. Whatever its official purpose, you suspect it saw use far beyond diagnosis, and that's the part that matters most. These medical objects and rituals, the oils, the massages, the steam baths and friction tools, weren't just clinical, they were contact. They allowed women, many for the first time, to interact with their bodies in ways that felt good. Maybe they didn't call it masturbation. Maybe they didn't even realize it. But their bodies did. Their bodies knew. You leave Arnaud's house with a crumpled page from his manuscript in hand, the words faded but legible. The woman is calmed by release, and her humours return to peace. There's no mention of sin, no punishment. Just a quiet acknowledgement that relief matters, that pleasure heals, and maybe, somewhere in the next town over, a woman will take her own copy of that text, light a candle, warm a compress, and run her hands exactly where she's been told to. Not because she wants to be wicked, but because she wants to be whole. And maybe, just maybe, she'll feel something that goes far beyond balance. Something like bliss. By the time you leave Arnaud's house, the sun is high and the world feels too bright for everything you now carry with you. Velvet secrets, pinewood tools, steam bath ecstasies disguised as medical care. And yet the day keeps turning. You follow a road that stretches beyond the town's edge, winding through groves of apple trees and fields of wheat, until you come to a walled garden, half overgrown, half cultivated, a strange blend of wildness and precision. Vines twist through trellises, flowers bloom in tight clusters and then sprawl recklessly. Bees hum, A fountain trickles quietly in the centre. This is no ordinary garden. This is the garden of earthly delights, or rather a version of it. You're not looking at Bosch's chaotic masterpiece, though you'll think of it later. This is the medieval hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, a symbolic space packed with theological metaphor, courtly romance, and, if you look close enough, more than a little sensual suggestion. You step through the low gate and at once you're wrapped in scent. Damask roses, sage, mint, violets. The air is thick with life, but it's also quiet. This garden isn't meant for gathering crops or tending livestock. It's meant for something else entirely. Meditation, yes. Solitude, but also fantasy. In medieval art and literature, gardens like this were often depicted as the setting for sacred encounters. The Virgin Mary receives the angel in a walled garden. Lovers in romances meet amid the roses. Even allegorical figures like Lady Reason or Dame Nature conduct their conversations beneath fig trees. But between all that holiness and high-minded dialogue, something else is blooming: desire. You sit near a hedge where a statue of a woman, stone-faced and serene, holds a blooming pomegranate. Her gown clings in all the wrong places, her expression is not modest, and behind her, a low stone bench is worn exactly in the spot where thighs would rest. Someone's been here before. This space, like many medieval gardens, is layered with metaphor. The pomegranate, fertility, the rose, virginity, the fountain. You already know. These gardens were designed to reflect virtue, but they couldn't help hinting at pleasure. Enclosed, hidden, controlled, but not inert. Your quirky fact of the day: in some medieval manuscripts, especially those written by courtly women, garden scenes are used as coded diaries. One 14th century noblewoman in Burgundy wrote a poem titled The Garden Within, where she describes laying among lilies and plucking ripe figs in secret. Sounds innocent until the line, "The dew gathered where I touched, and I drank until the silence sang." Literary scholars have tried to call it spiritual. Others say it's clearly erotic. Maybe it's both. And that's the thing. These gardens weren't just symbols of purity, they were paradoxes. They offered containment and freedom. You could walk here alone, away from the house, away from the eyes. You could breathe deeply, touch the petals, let your hand trail into the fountain just a little too long, and no one would question it. You walk through the rows of herbs, pausing at a patch of fennel and rue, plants historically associated with fertility, arousal, and feminine balance. Women would gather here not just for cooking herbs, but for whispers, remedies, maybe instructions. One woman says, "Place the leaves under your tongue before you dream." Another says, "Let the mint oil warm your palms before you touch." A ritual, a rhythm. In one corner of the garden sits a woven bench shaded by a climbing vine. You sit and close your eyes, letting the scent and breeze wrap around you. You can almost hear them, centuries of women passing through this space, some praying, some plotting, some simply lying back on the cool grass, slipping fingers beneath layers of cloth surrounded by bees and birdsong, finding themselves in a space where no one was asking questions and no one was watching. There's a documented example of this exact kind of garden used by nuns in southern France. Though technically a spiritual retreat, its layout included secluded alcoves, stone benches nestled behind hedges, and even a small bathing pool that could be heated with coals. One surviving journal from a visiting noblewoman, intended as a devotional reflection, includes a curious line: "I washed and waited, and the water taught me things I did not confess." That line has puzzled historians for years, but you get it. The garden didn't just offer women beauty, it gave them space, the kind of physical and emotional room required for self-exploration. A place where arousal could stretch out without being punished, where a woman could lie beneath the apple tree and think of saints, or a crush, or her own hands, and never have to explain. There's ongoing scholarly debate around the role of these gardens. Were they really places of secret pleasure? Or are we projecting too much meaning into vines and fountains? Traditionalists say they were spiritual metaphors. Others argue the repeated presence of sensual imagery can't be ignored. The garden becomes a liminal space, not quite sacred, not quite profane, which is precisely why it works. Because in a world that offered no bedroom privacy, no sexual education, and certainly no affirmation of female desire, gardens became more than just symbols. They became hiding places for heat. You walk back to the centre of the garden, near the trickling fountain. You dip your fingers into the water, cool and soft, and remember that for centuries this same gesture might have stirred something. A memory, a longing, a touch. Maybe a young girl would come here after her chores, sit with her skirts pulled slightly up, let her fingers explore what no one had named. Maybe she felt fear. Or maybe, just maybe, she felt like this garden, contained but lush, shaped by walls but growing wildly in her own way. As you leave through the wooden gate, your fingers still damp, you glance back once. A breeze rustles the roses, the pomegranate statue seems to smile. And somewhere behind that hedge, a woman waits, not for rescue, not for a lover, but for the next moment she can be alone in her own body, beneath sun and leaf, touching the root of herself without shame. You leave the garden just as the sun dips low behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the worn path ahead. The air smells of turned earth and ripening apples, the day softening into that familiar hush just before evening, when everything starts to exhale. You walk now with purpose, toward a story older than silk, older than saints, older even than the garden's tangled symbols, a story with teeth, one that shaped every whispered warning, every stitched secret, every burning blush behind shuttered windows. You're headed straight into the heart of the first and perhaps most enduring narrative of shame, the tale of Eve. She's everywhere in the medieval world, on cathedral walls, in stained glass windows painted into manuscripts, sculpted into stone archways, always with that apple, always naked but hiding, often scolded. Rarely defended. In the minds of medieval clergy and lay people alike, Eve wasn't just the mother of humanity, she was the mother of sin. And her greatest crime? Wanting, reaching, tasting, knowing. You step inside a chapel now, small and forgotten, tucked behind a crumbling stable. The roof leaks, and half the candles are stubs. But on the far wall, illuminated by the last streak of sunlight, is a faded fresco of Eve in the garden. She's beautiful, round, wild-haired, arms curled around her body. But her face is twisted in something that isn't quite guilt. It's more complicated. Like she's sorry, but not entirely. Like maybe, somewhere under the punishment, she remembers the thrill of biting into that fruit and realizing she felt something. And that's what you're here to unpack. In medieval theology, Eve's desire wasn't just a plot point, it was a framework. It shaped the entire way the church talked about female sexuality. Augustine, the go-to voice for post-Roman Christian morality, argued that Eve's temptation brought lust into the world. That before the fall, humans could engage in sex without shame, without desire, purely as a function, but after, suddenly bodies were unpredictable. Sin lived in the flesh, especially in women's flesh, which meant that from that moment on, every flicker of female pleasure was a kind of echo, a return to that first bite, that first touch, that original yes. But let's talk about the weird, lesser-known detail in all this. The fringe fact buried beneath centuries of sermons. Some medieval thinkers genuinely believed that Eve's sin wasn't just disobedience, it was masturbation. No, really? In a few obscure theological commentaries, rare but real, there's an interpretation that Eve's curiosity wasn't limited to the apple, that when she gained knowledge, she turned it inward, that she touched herself, and that this act opened the door to lust, to sin, to shame. Now, this wasn't mainstream doctrine. It's not something you'll find in official catechisms, but the idea slipped in through confessionals, local sermons, whispered teachings. The idea that the first woman wanted too much, knew too much, touched too deeply, and the result? Generations of women told to distrust their own fingertips. You sit in the back pew now, looking up at that fresco again. Eve's hand hovers just above the apple. But now you wonder if the artist meant something more, if that pose, that hesitation, wasn't just about a piece of fruit, but about the moment before you reach down and break a rule you were never meant to survive. And yet women didn't stop reaching. They may have been taught that desire was a wound, but they still pressed into it. And for many, Eve wasn't just a warning, she was a mirror. The first woman to act on hunger, the first to seek knowledge, the first to be punished for curiosity, not violence. There's a medieval poem, little known, tucked in the margins of a devotional manuscript from the 13th century. The author is anonymous, but the voice is clear. A woman writes, "I would have bitten it too, had I been there, not from hunger, but from wanting to feel the juice and taste what the world had hidden." She ends the poem not with repentance, but with defiance. Let God guard the gates. I walk in with my mouth open. Tell me that's not powerful. Of course, the scholars go back and forth. Some argue that medieval women fully internalized Eve's shame, that they feared their bodies and sought only to purify them. Others argue that even within that system, women found ways to reclaim her story. That Eve became not just a villain, but an origin point, a reminder that the body matters, that touch isn't always sin, that knowing yourself, really knowing, is both dangerous and divine. You leave the chapel now, but Eve stays with you, not the weeping Eve of penitential art, not the blame-ridden figure of Sunday sermons, but a different Eve, one with dirt under her nails and a smirk on her lips, a woman who looked at the most forbidden thing in the world and said, "Why not?" And maybe that's the question medieval women kept asking. Why not feel this? Why not touch myself when no one's looking? Why not let pleasure unfold in the quiet when everything else has been taken from me? They lived with the consequences, of course, confession, punishment, guilt, but beneath all of that, a spark, a legacy, a lineage of women who took the story of the first sinner and rewrote it not in ink, but in sensation. And perhaps tonight, in a stone-walled room, another woman will lie awake and think of Eve, not with scorn but with recognition. She'll place one hand between her thighs and whisper a thank you, not to God, not to the devil, but to the woman who reached first, because sometimes the fruit isn't forbidden. It's ripe, and it's waiting. The road twists now, narrowing into a dusty track lined with stones and wildflowers as you move farther from towns and closer to the kinds of places that don't show up on maps. The air feels dry, a little thinner, and there's a weight in your chest that isn't quite dread, but something close to curiosity laced with unease. You're headed into the strange territory of medieval medicine, where female pleasure was rarely acknowledged directly, but often blamed when things went wrong. Tonight, you're unwrapping one of the most misunderstood, and honestly, most ridiculous, medical theories of the time, the idea of the wandering womb. Yes, you read that right, the wandering womb. According to several medieval physicians, and before them, ancient Greek and Roman thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, a woman's uterus could become unmoored and start floating around her body. This was considered the cause of everything from fainting to hysteria, to seizures to choking fits, and even death. A restless womb, they claimed, was a dangerous thing. Now imagine living with that over your head every day. Not only were women taught that their bodies were inherently flawed, but that a literal organ could go rogue at any time if not properly managed. You step into the home of a healer named Sabina. She's not a university-trained doctor. She's a folk practitioner, somewhere between midwife and wise woman, and her house smells like warm milk, resin, and roasted roots. She greets you with a nod and sets a pot to boil, tossing in dried herbs with such ease it feels like muscle memory. "You'll hear about the womb," she says without looking up. "Aren't we all?" Sabina has spent her life dealing with the symptoms male doctors wrote about but never experienced. Cramps, heat, night sweats, dreams that left women flushed and shaken. The womb doesn't wander, she says plainly, but it does speak. And women, she tells you, have always known how to listen, even when no one else did. She pulls out a cloth-wrapped bundle from under the table. Inside is a clay jar filled with scented oil, a stone smoothed by decades of use, and a small handheld fan made from woven reeds. This, she says, is how we bring the womb back. The ritual involves warmth, pressure, breath, and, here's the part no one likes to say out loud, a very specific kind of stimulation. According to Sabina, a womb that feels neglected stirs the rest of the body into chaos. Not unlike the rest of us, she adds with a half smile. Her treatments include oil massages, low, slow, circular movements over the abdomen and thighs, along with warm compresses and sometimes guided release. We don't name it, she says, we just let it happen. And here's the strange, brilliant part. It works. Not because of magic or mysticism, but because Sabina is giving these women something the formal medical establishment refused to. Permission to feel, to explore, to finish. Let's go deeper into the scholarly side. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of humours, 4 bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that needed to stay in balance. Women were thought to be cold and wet by nature, overly governed by blood. When this blood, a polite way of saying sexual energy, built up, it needed to be fathomed, or else it could rot, stagnate, or send the womb wandering in search of heat. That's where things get unintentionally funny. One medical text from the 13th century describes the womb as a greedy animal, always hungry for moisture and warmth, curling upward through the chest if denied them. The prescribed cure? Sweet-smelling herbs placed near the nose and foul-smelling herbs between the legs to lure the womb back into place. Like it's a confused cat. But Sabina isn't working with confused cats, she's working with desperate women. She tells you about a widow who came to her after months of sleeplessness and crushing melancholy. Doctors blamed her age, her priests blamed Eve. But Sabina? She touched her belly, felt the tension, and knew. She hadn't touched herself in years, she explains, didn't even remember how. So Sabina guided her, slowly, gently, with warm oil and steady pressure, not as a lover, but as a healer. By the time she left, Sabina says, she cried, not from shame, from remembering she was still in there. That's what gets lost in all the medical nonsense, the core truth that a woman's pleasure is not a luxury or a sin, but a form of return, a reclamation. Now, not all scholars agree on this interpretation. Some argue that treatments like Sabina's were rooted in superstition, not pleasure, that they were never meant to encourage masturbation but to prevent it, redirecting the desire towards something clinical. But others say the line is thin. When the treatment includes oil, privacy, and guided touch, it's hard to pretend the outcome isn't sensual, especially when the women return, not just healed, but glowing. Sabina leans over and lights a small brazier filled with mint and mugwort. The scent fills the room, sharp and heady. Most of what we treat, she says, is longing. We just call it by other names. She shows you a wooden tool, narrow, curved, worn smooth. To press the womb, she claims. But you know, so does she. And that's the secret at the heart of this whole wandering womb theory, that it was never about the uterus moving around like a confused ghost. It was about explaining away what couldn't be controlled, female arousal, female pleasure, female autonomy, and instead of embracing it, they turned it into an illness. But women like Sabina turned it right back. You watch her pack up her tools, wipe the oil from her hands, and prepare her room for the next visitor. Another woman will come soon, with tightness in her belly and shame in her voice, and Sabina will teach her too not how to pray it away or fear it or bury it, but how to listen, to soothe, to press the heat instead of hiding it. As you step back into the fading light, the air is warm against your face. The earth beneath your feet feels steadier somehow, and you realize again what medieval women must have felt in their most private moments, that despite the sermons, the medicine, the myths, they knew what their bodies needed. Not gods, not scholars, not husbands, just them, just a little heat, little time, and the freedom to follow wherever the womb, real or metaphorical, wanted to go. The light is changing again, blue now, edged with the softest silver, as twilight begins its quiet descent. You've left the wild herbs and wandering wombs behind, but tonight's destination takes you somewhere even more intimate. You're returning to the chapel, but not the kind where saints stare down from stained glass or sermons echo off marble walls. No, this place is hidden beneath one, beneath the floorboards, behind a cracked stone arch, where cool air lingers and forgotten things sleep. You're entering a space untouched for centuries, and inside it, a drawer. Not a metaphorical drawer, a real one, wooden, shallow, built into the frame of an old prayer kneeler, once used by the nuns of an abbey that was abandoned in the late 1400s and eventually buried by time and moss. The kneeler was uncovered during renovations just decades ago, half rotted, full of dust. Most thought it was empty, but beneath the warped baseboard was a narrow compartment, and what it held rewrites the story. Inside were two small carved objects, both phallic in shape, smoothed by hand, wrapped in linen. Alongside them, a short journal, its pages fragile but mostly intact. The script? Clear, elegant, written by a woman who identified herself only as S, a nun, a sister, a woman of God, and something else. You're reading her journal now, seated on the old stone steps with the faint scent of damp earth and incense curling through the air. S doesn't name her abbey. She doesn't name her confessor, but she names desire, over and over, like a prayer. I have lived two lives, she writes, the one they see and the one that wakes me in the dark. She speaks of dreams so vivid she wakes soaked with sweat, of kneeling in prayer and feeling heat curl low in her belly, of evenings spent alone in the scriptorium, where the sound of her own breath became louder than any psalm, and eventually she writes of carving. I began with the wood from a broken stool, small, rounded, polished, until it sang against my hand. She used beeswax to seal it, and linen to keep it hidden. She named it her second voice. She doesn't say the word masturbation. That word didn't exist in the way we use it now, but she says this: I touched not for sin, but for sentence, for remembering that I am more than a soul in a habit. It's a strange kind of relic, this drawer of carved secrets, not holy, not profane, just human. Now, the church has long tried to erase this kind of story. Even now the objects aren't on display, they are stored quietly in a museum archive labelled as personal devotional items, which, depending on your imagination, isn't entirely wrong. Scholars debate their use. Some insist they were fertility charms, others suggest therapeutic massage tools. But if you read S's words, if you hold the linen-wrapped wood in your hands, if you listen, you know, this wasn't a tool for health, it was a tether to herself. S writes that she wasn't the only one. We did not speak of it, she notes, but there were eyes that met mine in the candlelight with knowing. She describes a sister who hummed softly during evening prayers, her body swaying more than necessary. Another who asked too many questions about herbs that heat the blood. These were not accidents. They were signals, glances passed beneath veils, a shared understanding that what the church couldn't name, women would still find. Your fringe fact tonight. In the early 15th century, a bishop's report from a monastery in what's now northern Spain accused several nuns of suspicious behaviour at night and confiscated a set of instruments not befitting chastity. The items were never described in detail, but the language used, carved in the likeness of the masculine and softened with oils, left little to the imagination. The report was buried, redacted, forgotten, but the truth poked through, because of course women touched themselves, even in the heart of sacred spaces, especially there. Where else were they free from men, from marriage, from the noise? This drawer, S's drawer, is more than a stash spot. It's a time capsule, proof that for at least one woman the act of self-pleasure wasn't rebellion. It was ritual, something done with care, with rhythm, with gratitude, something woven into her daily life, right alongside rosary beads and candle wicks. She describes the moment after, lying flat, palms open, whispering psalms not out of shame but peace. I do not think God is angered, she writes. I think he listens. I think he understands the music I make with my breath. That's where the scholarly debate rages hardest. Some insist that nuns like S were anomalies, that their actions were deviations, not reflections of any broader experience. But others argue that these moments, though rarely recorded, must have been more common than we assume. After all, what kind of system forces young women into vows of chastity, locks them in cells, encourages them to purge every impure thought, and then pretends their bodies simply comply? The drawer says otherwise. You close the journal slowly, fingers lingering on the brittle edge of the parchment. You trace the grain of the wooden object wrapped beside it, and you feel, somehow, not like a voyeur but a witness, like someone who's just been entrusted with a secret too precious to keep buried. You step back into the chapel's main room. Above you the crucifix looms, but it doesn't feel angry, just watchful, maybe even tender, because maybe, just maybe, holiness isn't the opposite of pleasure. Maybe it's what happens when the two meet in quiet defiance. You walk out into the night air, stars just starting to press through the dark, and somewhere beneath layers of stone and moss and dust that drawer remains, still hidden, still real, still holding the truth that women, even in their most sacred roles, still reached for themselves. Not in sin, not in secrecy, but in the quiet, pulsing act of remembering they were whole. You leave the chapel ruins behind with the air crisp on your skin and something like reverence trailing behind your steps. The moon has crested the tree line now, laying a thin silver gloss over everything it touches, the rooftops, the stone fences, the still warm road. You walk for a while, farther out this time, past the abbeys and markets and manor walls, until the paths lose their edges and fields stretch wide into the dark. There's a cottage here, hunched low beneath the sky, half swallowed by the tall grass. No spires, no shrines, just a thatched roof, a sagging door, and a curl of smoke threading into the night. Welcome to the world of the medieval peasant woman. This is where most women lived. not in noble halls or sacred cloisters, not surrounded by saints or scandal, just here. In small homes with chickens outside and children inside, with aching backs and rough hands and a rhythm of life so constant that pleasure often got left in the margins, unless, of course, you made space for it. You knock, and the woman who answers the door is named Edda. She's not young, not old, just real. There's dirt on her skirt, flour on her arms, and a calm in her eyes that comes from surviving more than one hard season. She offers you bread before words, then pulls up a stool by the hearth and begins to talk as if you've always been here. You want to know how we handle the ache, she says simply, hands folded, eyes on the fire. Well, it depends on the day. That ache. She means the one that builds quietly over time. Not lust the way poets write about it, not sin or scandal or spectacle. Just the slow, steady hum that starts when your body remembers itself after hours bent over a washboard or hauling water or stretching wool across the frame. And for women like Edda, that hum had to be answered with what was available: time, privacy, and practicality. Edda's house has no hidden drawer, no silver bed linens, no moonstone tools. What she has is a bench worn smooth where she kneels to grind grain. A rounded stone she keeps near the hearth for warming, useful for muscle aches and other kinds. A small strip of cloth she wraps around her thighs, not for modesty, but for pressure. And her hands. Always her hands. I didn't know what I was doing the first time, she admits. It just happened. I was bathing and the water moved, I moved, and there it was. The quiet. She smiles at the memory, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. After that turning, I learned how to find it again. Sometimes with the stone, sometimes in the barn, wherever no one's watching. Here's your quirky footnote for the night. In a 14th century German folk remedy book, tucked between recipes for cough syrup and poultices for bruises, is a short line about the warming of womanly blood through circular massage and breath. No source cited, no explanation given, just a note to let the touch be rhythmic and steady until release of the red vapours. That's not treating a fever. That's describing something else entirely. The scholarly debate, of course, argues over whether medieval peasant women had the time, or even the knowledge, to engage in self-pleasure. One side says they were too burdened, too uneducated, too monitored. The other side points out that where there are bodies, there is instinct. That even without books or sanctuaries, women knew how to seek relief. That pleasure isn't a luxury. It's a language the body speaks, whether or not you're taught the words. You sit by the hearth with Edda as she tends to her pot of herbs, stirring clockwise then counter. She tells you about her friend Lena, who never married and lived in the woods with 2 goats and a love of mushrooms. Lena once gave her a handful of dried roots and told her to grind them into oil for the kind of pain only quiet hands can reach. Edda used it sparingly, mostly on her lower belly during moon sickness, but once she used it with her own fingers, slowly, under the stars. It was, she says, like coming home to myself. And this is what matters most, the idea of ownership, of knowing your own body well enough to find its edges in the dark. For peasant women whose days were ruled by weather and work, that act wasn't just about pleasure. It was about returning to something internal, unspoken, entirely theirs. There's an old hearth saying she recites while adding wood to the fire. Better the flame you stoke yourself than the one that burns you uninvited. It's meant as a warning against unwanted touch, but Edda reclaims it with a knowing glance. She's never said the word masturbation, but she doesn't need to. Her language is older than that. Her pleasure doesn't ask for naming. Before you leave, she presses a bit of smooth beeswax into your palm. Try warming it with your breath before you use it, she says, eyes twinkling. The heat helps. No further instruction. She assumes you'll understand, and you do. You step back outside beneath a quilt of stars, and somewhere behind you Edda settles into the bed, tucking herself under layers of wool and thyme. Maybe before sleep takes her, she'll reach for that familiar cloth or stone, not with guilt, not with desperation, just with the calm of someone who knows how to quiet her own ache. Because even without saints or silk or scholarly scrolls, women like Edda found ways to feel good. In the barn, in the bath, in the flicker of firelight when the night finally belonged to no one but them. And that, perhaps, is the clearest truth yet. No matter how rough the world, the body still remembers softness, and the hands, they follow. The night deepens as you walk on, the stars sharpening overhead, the road narrowing into a quiet loneliness. There's a hush to this stretch of land, a kind of ancient quiet that presses at your back like a hand. It's the hour when the world feels suspended, when people sleep and the things they dare not say during daylight finally slip out in dreams. But you're not dreaming. You're moving toward a space where speech was both forbidden and preserved, where women's thoughts, especially the intimate, trembling ones, were carved into wax, inked onto parchment and buried beneath layers of metaphor. Tonight, you're walking into the scriptorium. You arrive at a small priory long deserted, its windows shattered by storms no one remembers, its library strangely intact. The heavy oak door groans open, and the scent of dust, old leather, and ink-stained time fills your lungs. A beam of moonlight cuts through the ruin's roof and falls onto a writing desk, and there, half forgotten, curled like a sleeping animal, is a manuscript. You crack it open. And what's inside doesn't read like a sermon or medical treatise. It reads like longing. We need to talk about medieval women's poetry, and not the kind you find in official collections, polished and passed through male scribes. This is different. This is the fragmented verse found in the margins of prayer books, in personal journals, even in court records. Snippets that pulse with something electric, something felt. One passage, scrawled in a hand that's careful but unsure, reads, "In the night I made the sign of the cross and let my hand wander further. I told myself it was for peace, but I found more." There's no name, no title, just that line. Tucked in the back of a book of Psalms, right between a passage on suffering and one on divine mercy. That's the kind of subversion women practiced in script. When they couldn't say I touched myself, they wrote I wandered. When they couldn't write I craved, they wrote my body was restless. And when they couldn't say I finished, they said the silence broke and left me whole. Sitting now on the bench beneath that broken roof, you read a poem copied in Latin, but likely written by a woman whose identity has been lost to time. The translation runs something like this. She brought the oil with her breath and warmed by thought alone, and there, in her quiet bed, her fingers sang louder than any priest. It's not crass, it's not explicit, it's intimate, and that's the magic of these texts. They remind us that for all the noise the medieval world made about sin, some women wrote their desire into permanence, not loudly but stubbornly, line by line, hidden in metaphors, wrapped in religious language, but unmistakable if you knew how to read it. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In a 14th century convent in Hainaut, a nun's notebook was discovered containing Latin prayers with unusual phrasing, repetitions of words like thirst, quivering to, and climbing. A historian argued that it was devotional language. Another scholar pushed back, suggesting it was quasi-erotic mysticism. And then someone else, quietly in a footnote, wondered if it might not be mysticism at all. Just a woman recording what her body did when she touched herself and called it prayer, because that was the only word allowed. That's the ongoing debate. Were these women mystics, or were they just deeply, beautifully alone? Some historians argue that sexual ecstasy and religious ecstasy were often indistinguishable in the language of the time. Others argue the overlap was intentional because it was the only safe place for women to express desire. When you couldn't write I want, you wrote I long for God. When you couldn't say I came, you said I felt lifted. But behind the veil of theology, the reality often pulses through. Women wrote about hair, about breath, about shivers and wetness and aching and peace. They just used symbols, lamps going out and being reignited, the sweet oil of the bridegroom, the wound that closes when touched with love. You find a fragment here that nearly takes your breath. He did not come, but I did. Alone, with linen and the psalter open beside me, I sang the song of songs and answered it with my skin. Imagine being her, quill in hand, the candle burning low, heart pounding with the risk of writing it down, knowing someone might read it, knowing no one might, but still needing to say it. And here's the strange, lovely irony. Many of these women were writing in Latin, a language reserved for scholars and priests, men who'd never speak of their own bodies, let alone women's. But these women? They bent Latin to their will. They turned it into a language of touch, of pulse, of midnight solitude and post-release quiet. You run your fingers across one such page now, its corners browned with age, its ink faded to ghost script. The words are barely visible, but their meaning hums beneath the surface. A woman wrote this, not for glory, Not for fame, but because after touching herself she needed to speak it somehow, and if no one would hear her voice, maybe the parchment would, and maybe that was enough. Outside, the moon has shifted, pouring its light directly onto the page. You sit in Vance, the air so still you can hear the ink's memory breathing, and you realise these aren't just poems, they're testimonies. Proof that even in a world where desire was punished, women still dared to record their pleasure. Carefully, secretly, but permanently. And that's the softest rebellion of all. The moon has begun its slow descent, dragging the stars with it, and the horizon glows with that faint bruised colour just before dawn. But you're not finished. There's one last place to go tonight, a space that exists outside of borders, outside of church bells and manor walls and dusty scrolls. You're headed toward the edge of the forest again, though this has time deeper than before, past the tidy herbs, past the carved spoons, past even the gardens of metaphor and embroidered innuendo. This is where stories lose their polish, where myth and medicine mix freely. This is the world of the cunning woman. She has a dozen names, depending on where you find her. Wise woman, herb wife, witch, midwife, bone knitter, moon teller. But they all mean the same thing. A woman who knows things she wasn't supposed to know. She's not just healing wounds or delivering babies. She's guiding people through the murky territory of need. And yes, that includes desire. You find her cottage tucked beneath a leaning willow, its roof patched with bark, the doorway barely wide enough for 2 shoulders. She doesn't open the door when you knock. You walk in, and she's already there, stirring something thick and red in a clay pot, humming under her breath in a language that doesn't care whether it's remembered. She looks up and grins, all teeth and crow's feet. Took you long enough. You sit beside the fire without being told, and she offers you a cup of something bitter and warm. It kicks your tongue awake like pepper and dirt and memory. And then she says, "So, you want to know how we really did it? Not did it, did this. The secret acts, the unspoken touch, the midnight rituals that no one wrote down because they couldn't be explained. This is the part of the story that doesn't live in books or scrolls. It lives in breath, in hands, in dreams passed down mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, with a wink and a recipe that always left something out on purpose." She pulls a bundle from a woven pouch. It smells like cloves and smoke. Inside, a carved root, oddly shaped, polished smooth. "Angelica," she says, "shaped it while it dried, heated in milk, rubbed with goose fat." She says this casually, like she's talking about making bread. But it's not bread, it's a tool, or maybe it's a friend. You ask if it's for healing. She shrugs. Isn't pleasure a kind of healing? You've heard it before, from the widow, from the nun, from the woman with the beeswax tucked into her sleeve, but from this one it sounds more like a spell than a question. She begins listing old names: St. John's Candle, Red Root, Moonkeeper's Wine. These are not modern brands of candle scents. They're ritual ingredients, some real, some maybe imagined, used by women to stir things, to bring warmth, to cool the blood downward. She talks about women coming to her, eyes wide with fear, or frustration, or exhaustion. They don't always say it, but I can tell. And what does she give them? Sometimes a bath of ginger and rose hips, sometimes a salve made with honey and ground violet petals, sometimes just a place to lie down where no one's watching. And once, she says this while laughing into her bowl, a long feather and a set of instructions whispered in a mix of Latin, French, and nonsense. She came back the next day and brought me butter and a song. That's the kind of economy women like her worked in. Butter, secrets, peace. Now let's be clear. Historically, cunning women were both revered and reviled. They were midwives, healers, and therapists before therapists existed. But they were also accused of witchcraft, especially when their remedies strayed too close to pleasure or autonomy. A woman who gave another woman the means to enjoy her own body without a man, that was dangerous. And yet they persisted. There's an archived court record from 15th century Wales where a healer was accused of giving herb and balm to a maiden who thereafter touched herself in the absence of sin. The phrasing is bizarre. What does absence of sin even mean? Scholars aren't sure, and some think the girl confessed that the act didn't feel sinful, that she had, through touch, found something holy, and that it had begun with the cunning woman's salve. That's the scholarly debate tonight. Were these women merely midwives, working within the boundaries of what was acceptable? Or were they quietly pushing those boundaries, offering not just healing but liberation? Most records are vague, innuendo, testimony blurred by fear and translation, but oral history says otherwise. The woman in the cottage opens a drawer beneath her hearth and pulls out a box wrapped in rabbit fur. Inside, an assortment of objects that look like ritual tools, but not for summoning spirits or hexing cows. Small stones shaped to fit into palms, a phallus carved from redwood and worn with use, a cloth pouch filled with what she calls the warming powder, which turns out to be cayenne, mint and powdered bark. She tells you to mix it with oil, only a drop or you'll feel like a fox on fire. These weren't spells, they were instructions, but that they had to be hidden, because any woman who taught another how to find joy alone, who gave her permission, materials, space, was a threat. To the church, to marriage, to silence. Still the knowledge lived on, passed hand to hand, not as books, but as bundles. Not as sermons, but as side-eyes and muttered advice and recipes scribbled on the backs of flour sacks. And often, pleasure was treated the same way as pain because the line was blurry. When a woman ached and couldn't explain why, the cunning woman knew. She would place a hand on the belly, stir her pot and say something like, "What your womb wants is not a baby, it's you." And that was all. As you stand to leave, the woman in the cottage presses a small bundle into your palm, cloth wax, something soft and strange. "It won't fix the world," she says, "but it might help you breathe." You nod. You don't need the full spell, just the trust that someone long ago believed your pleasure mattered. You step back into the clearing and the first birds are beginning to call. The sky has softened into blue, and you walk on, bundle in hand, into a world that still doesn't know how to talk about what women do in the dark, but where they've always known how to do it anyway. Because whether in a forest, a convent, a field, or a stone-walled bedroom, there have always been women whispering to each other, "Yes, you can." Dawn stretches slow and quiet across the hills, painting everything in pale gold and whispering away the mysteries of night. You've walked through gardens and graveyards, tapped fingers against tapestry threads and velvet hems, listened at the doorways of abbeys and cottages and dim-lit bedrooms. And now, as the sky blooms above you, you come to a place that's neither public nor private, but somewhere in between. It's the crossroads, not the metaphorical kind, the literal one, where four paths meet and nothing is marked, but everything is remembered. There's an old wooden post here, moss curling around its base and a low stone wall crumbling nearby. The wind carries no scent of incense or stew, just grass, earth, breath. It's quiet, but under that quiet, a hum, the kind you've started to recognize, not from a place or a person, but from memory. From everything the medieval world tried to cover, shame, sermonize, or erase. Because tonight, no, this morning, we're standing where the stories meet. You sit on the wall and begin to thread the pieces together. There's the noble woman with silk between her thighs, wrapped in fur and secrets. There's the nun who carved herself a psalm and tucked it into a kneeler. There's the herbalist with her root-carved remedies and wry instructions whispered by candlelight. There's Edda, the peasant woman with warm stone and beeswax. The garden's sacred hush, the poetry scrawled in Latin on the backs of hymnals, the stone bench beneath the vines, and all the things they never got to say out loud, but they did say them, just not in ways men knew how to hear. And that's the great, delicious twist of it all. Medieval women were never as silent as history pretended. They were just speaking in a language not everyone could read, a language of fabric and herbs, of gestures, of stitched innuendo and ritual bathwater, of margin notes and coded flowers, of fingertips and breath and pleasure, because that's what this has always been about. Not lust, not scandal, not seduction, just this, a woman, alone, feeling good, not because someone told her she could, not because a husband or priest unlocked it for her, but because her body remembered how. There's a moment, right here, right now, where it's tempting to declare this a grand act of rebellion, a feminist triumph echoing across time. And yes, of course there's power in that. There's defiance in every private moan, in every hidden touch, in every carved route passed from hand to hand like a relic of freedom. But it wasn't always rebellion. Sometimes it was just necessity. To be a woman in the medieval world was to be constantly handled, judged, instructed and blamed. Your body was always under someone's ownership, father, husband, confessor, physician, priest. But your desire, your pleasure, that quietly, stubbornly remained yours. Even if you couldn't name it, even if you were punished for it, even if you didn't fully understand it. there was always that private moment at the end of the day. When the chores were done, when the door was bolted, when you lay still, pressed your palms to your belly and let the ache unspool. You think back to the confessionals. How many women sat behind that latticework, voice trembling, and said things like, "I touched myself," or "I burned in the night," or "My dreams left me wet"? How many priests scolded them? How many doctors prescribed hot cloths and steam without ever admitting what it was really for? How many women walked away still not sure if they were healed or damned, but relieved either way? And yet, it continued. Because pleasure, for all its risks, is a teacher. It tells you something about yourself that no one else can, that you are alive, that your body is yours. That sensation isn't shameful, it's sacred. That touch can be a prayer if no one else is listening. And for medieval women, that knowledge, quiet, unspoken, deeply felt, was the closest thing to freedom most of them ever knew. Here's your fringe fact for this chapter. In a small collection of 14th century folk songs from Flanders, there's one verse that seems utterly out of place. It's not a hymn, it's not a harvest chant, it's a song sung from the perspective of a woman at her spinning wheel, describing, very coyly, how the motion of the spindle beneath her skirt woke her from sleep. She repeats the line, "And I turned again and again I sung," until the song ends in a soft hum. Was it just a joke? A dirty pun? Maybe. Or maybe it was the only way she could put her experience into the public voice. That's the scholarly debate now, as it was then. Were all these references, garden vines, coded stitches, bedside tools, warming powders, really about self-pleasure? Or are we seeing what we want to see? Are we projecting 21st century ideas onto 13th century lives? But maybe that question misses the point. Maybe what matters is not how we interpret these moments, but that they existed. Because evidence isn't just in ink, it's in what survives. Like a worn spot on a stone bench in a garden no longer tended. Like a polished wooden shape found wrapped in linen beneath the altar. Like the margins of a prayer book filled with wandering words. Like a bit of fur sewn into the hem of a cloak. Like the soft part of the mattress no one ever mentioned but never failed to use. And here now at the crossroads, with the sun rising and the earth stretching awake, you feel it. The enormity of all those tiny secret acts. Thousands of years, millions of women, one instinct: to feel good. To come back to themselves, to leave a little mark on fabric, on parchment, in memory, that says, "I was here, and I was not ashamed." You rise slowly, the crossroads still quiet beneath your feet. The sky above you is pale gold, the world is wide open, and somewhere centuries ago, a woman is waking in her bed, alone, her fingers already curling beneath the sheets. You've circled back now, through shadow and silk, saints and steam, through bone-handled tools and half-spoken poetry, back into the steady breath of morning. You're no longer chasing a single story, you're standing in the middle of hundreds, all overlapping like threads in a tapestry so worn that most people only see the holes. But you've seen the embroidery, you've run your fingers over the stitching, and now, in these final steps, you're holding the full weight of what they left behind. There's no grand building left to visit. No last hidden chamber or secret drawer. Just a hill. A real one, not metaphorical, rising up over the valley where all these women lived and died and breathed and touched. The grass is damp underfoot. The sky is washed clean. You sit there, finally still, and begin piecing it together. Medieval women weren't supposed to know pleasure. Not according to church law, not according to medicine, not according to the ink-stained hands of confessors and chroniclers who never once considered what it felt like to live inside a female body. But even so, women did know. Deeply, instinctively, creatively, desperately, they found ways. Maybe they didn't call it masturbation. Maybe they didn't even think of it as rebellion. Maybe it was just relief. Maybe it was survival, but there's no question that it happened. Again and again, in nun cells, in peasant baths, on silk sheets, on packed hay, under moonlight, behind veils, through linen and wool and nothing at all, sometimes in guilt, often in silence, but never without knowing. They knew, and what they passed to each other through gestures and glances, and recipes and riddles, wasn't just how to feel pleasure, it was how to claim something in a world that denied them nearly everything. One woman lined her shift with velvet and pressed it against herself while praying. Another steeped ginger, and mint and slipped her fingers lower while her husband snored. Another carved her own relief, wrapped it in cloth and hid it where no one would think to look. Another wrote in a dead language, disguising her climax as a vision of the Virgin. Another whispered to a neighbour that she had a new kind of warming salve just to drop, but it changed everything. These weren't accidents. These weren't flukes. These were women inventing a language that didn't exist yet. A language of touch, of body, of ownership. Even if the words were borrowed from scripture or medicine or nonsense folklore, they made them mean something new. You think about all the times they were told, no, you may not own your body. No, you may not speak desire. No, you may not know what makes you feel alive. No, you may not want. No, you may not finish, but the body doesn't understand. No. The body, when left alone, when given quiet and warmth and a single moment to breathe, remembers. It remembers pleasure like it remembers breath. Something built in. Something cellular, something older than scripture, older than guilt and sin. That's the fringe fact you leave with tonight. Not a quirky object or dusty quote, but this, that many medieval women, even when robbed of language, found their way back to themselves through the one form of literacy they could never be denied. Touch. Touch as protest, touch as prayer, touch as inheritance. And scholars still argue over the details. Was this really sexual? Was it truly subversive? Were they empowered or trapped? The truth is yes, all of it. Pleasure in the medieval world wasn't a single thread. It was a knot. Complicated, dangerous. Sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter. But always felt. Because here's what no scholar or priest or historian can fully erase. The fact that these women lived in bodies. Real ones. Flesh that bled, ached and pulsed with need. They weren't waiting to be rescued. They weren't dreaming of princes or confessions. Many of them were just trying to get through the day. But sometimes when the room was quiet and the door was locked and no one was asking anything of them, they remembered they were still allowed to feel good. And they did. Not because the world gave them permission, but because their bodies never needed it. You lie back now, the hill warm beneath you, the sun slipping over the edge of the world like a sigh. The air smells of dew and grass and something like the past, not in mourning but in understanding. In a long exhale, the stories you've gathered, tender and awkward, sacred and sweaty, lonely and luminous, aren't gone. They were just waiting, under dust, behind shame, beneath lace and leaves and lore, and now you've heard them, which means, in some way, you've inherited them. The woman who pressed herself against her garden bench while pretending to pluck figs, the nun who carved her own release and dared to write it down, the peasant who warmed a stone and wrapped it in cloth like a secret lover, the cunning woman with her mint salve and feather spells. All of them. They're yours now. You get to remember them. Not just as sinners or rebels or shadows, but as women who dared to feel good in a world that punished them for it. And maybe, when you're alone next, hands quiet, thoughts wandering, you'll think of them. Maybe you'll feel less alone. Maybe you'll press your fingers a little lower and smile, because you're not the first, and you won't be the last. So here we are. The night has faded, the sun has fully risen, and you've walked across centuries, barefoot in some places, side-eyed in others, listening to women who were never supposed to be remembered for this, for touching, for aching, for knowing themselves in ways history still isn't entirely comfortable with. You've sat with nuns and widows and midwives and dreamers. You've read between the lines of psalms and poems, traced the shapes of objects no museum labels clearly, and stood quietly in gardens where nothing was ever planted by accident. And maybe now, as you sit with all of this, you feel something else. Not scandal. Not even surprise. Just recognition. Because the truth is, you knew this was possible all along. Deep down, you've always known that women, all women, have always found ways to return to their own bodies, no matter the rules, no matter the risks, no matter the absence of language, because pleasure is ancient, intuitive. It requires no permission, no choreography, no witness. But let's be honest, this story wasn't about discovery. It was about remembering. Remembering that even in the most controlled, silenced, guarded eras, there were always cracks in the walls, always hushed spaces where fingers found their rhythm and breath found its release, always a handmaid of curiosity hiding in the folds of a linen shift, always one woman showing another how to warm the oil just right, always laughter behind veils, always a whispered yes like that. And in remembering them, maybe you've remembered something in yourself too. So before you go back to your day, whatever it looks like, pause, take a breath, take another, and let this linger. Let the warmth stay with you, not in the form of facts or footnotes, but in the way your shoulders settle, the way your pulse slows, the way your body even now thanks you for listening, because maybe, just maybe, she's been waiting for you to come home to her, not with shame, with softness, with curiosity, with the same question they asked in gardens, in abbeys, on worn stone floors. What if I touched and nothing bad happened? What if I liked it? What if I came back to myself and it was holy? Thanks for walking this story with me.